My grandmother passed away without leaving a will, giving my father total control of her massive estate. He handed the keys to my younger brother right in front of me and smirked, stating I would not get a single cent and needed to stop living in his shadow. I just picked up my coat and walked out without a tear. Because what they did not know was that a stranger was about to knock on my door with a sealed envelope containing documents that would turn their newfound billionaire lifestyle into a federal crime. Before I tell you how I took back my family legacy and watched their house of cards collapse, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe karma always collects its debts. I am Maya, 35 years old, and the founder of a sustainable urban development firm here in Atlanta. Today should have been the most solemn day of my life. The heavy Georgia air hung thick outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of Grandma Estelle's historic estate, but inside the atmosphere was even more suffocating. This house, with its sweeping mahogany staircases and crystal chandeliers, had been my sanctuary growing up. Today it felt like a crowded auction house. I stood in the corner of the massive formal dining room, balancing a heavy silver tray of catered food, my black morning dress clinging uncomfortably to my skin. My feet throbbed from standing since dawn, but I kept moving, serving plates to extended family members, who seemed more interested in networking and calculating the square footage of the property than mourning the matriarch who had built it all. Grandma Estelle was the only person in this bloodline who truly understood me. She built a real estate empire from nothing, navigating the complexities of the Atlanta business world with a sharp mind and an unforgiving work ethic. While the rest of the family saw my dedication to sustainable housing as a waste of time, she saw my vision. Now she was gone, and the vultures were circling. I watched my father Calvin holding court by the grand fireplace. At 62, he carried himself with an unearned arrogance, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon while laughing loudly with a local city councilman. He was not shedding a single tear. Across the room, my 33-year-old brother Jamal was already acting like the lord of the manor. He was leaning against Grandma Estelle's antique grand piano, adjusting his custom-tailored suit, while his white wife Chloe complained to one of the catering staff about the temperature of the appetizers. I took a deep breath and carried a fresh tray of food toward the sitting area, intending to set it on the side table and retreat to the kitchen for a moment of quiet. As I approached the heavy velvet drapes separating the rooms, I stopped. The hushed voices of my Aunt Viv and Cousin Terence drifted through the fabric, and my own name caught my attention. I froze, leaning slightly closer to the wall. "Maya looks completely exhausted," Aunt Viv whispered, her tone dripping with that signature Southern pity that always masked a deeper judgment. "Well, she works far too hard for that little urban development firm of hers," Terence replied with a quiet scoff. "All that sustainable housing nonsense she insists on pursuing. She spends her days arguing with city planners for pennies. She really should have learned a thing or two from Jamal." I gripped the edges of the silver tray so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Oh, absolutely," Aunt Viv agreed enthusiastically. "Jamal has that natural business acumen just like Calvin. He knows how to move money and handle the real players in this city. He is cut out for the big leagues." It is a shame Maya never inherited that drive. The sheer delusion of their conversation made my stomach turn. Jamal and his so-called natural business acumen was a running joke to anyone who actually looked at the numbers. Just last year, he lost $250,000 on a disastrous cryptocurrency scam that he swore was a guaranteed fortune. Who bailed him out quietly to save the family name? Grandma Estelle did. Before that, it was a failed luxury car rental service. Before that, a disastrous investment in a restaurant that closed within 6 months. Jamal had never built a single successful enterprise in his life. He simply existed on the safety net of Grandma Estelle's bank accounts, while Calvin continuously praised him as a visionary. Meanwhile, I had spent the last decade building my firm brick by brick. I secured city contracts, fought for community grants, and developed green housing projects that actually benefited our neighborhoods. I earned every single thing I had through relentless hard work. Yet in this house, in this family, I would always be the struggling scapegoat while Jamal remained the golden child who could do no wrong. I stepped around the velvet drapes, letting my heels click loudly on the hardwood floor. Aunt Viv and Terrence instantly stopped talking, their faces shifting into exaggerated masks of sympathy. Maya, sweetie. Aunt Viv cooed, reaching out to pat my arm. You are working too hard today. Let the catering staff handle the food. You need to rest. I am perfectly fine, Aunt Viv, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level as I offered them the tray. I find that staying productive helps keep my mind clear. Please enjoy the food. I did not wait for their response. I turned and walked away, navigating through the sea of relatives and business associates who were treating my grandmother's repast like a corporate mixer. The entire house smelled of expensive floral arrangements and opportunistic greed. Every conversation I passed seemed to revolve around property values, stock portfolios, and who would take over the various commercial buildings Grandma Estelle had acquired over her lifetime. I found a brief moment of solitude near the back hallway where the noise of the crowd was muffled. I leaned my head against the cool plaster wall and closed my eyes, wishing I could hear Grandma Estelle's voice just one more time. She used to pull me into her private study away from Calvin's loud boasting and Jamal's entitlement and tell me that real power was quiet. She taught me that the loudest person in the room was usually the weakest. As I stood there gathering my strength, I heard the sharp clicking of Chloe's designer heels approaching. She turned the corner and spotted me, a condescending smile immediately forming on her face. At 31, she had been married to my brother for 3 years and had seamlessly adopted my father's habit of treating me like the hired help. Maya. There you are, Chloe said, crossing her arms over her expensive black dress. Your father is gathering everyone in the main hall. He has an important announcement to make about the estate. You should probably hurry. We would not want you to miss out on family business even if it does not really concern you. I looked at her calculating expression, recognizing the trap being set. They had been waiting for this moment since the funeral service ended. I straightened my posture, pushing down the exhaustion and the grief. I am right behind you, Chloe, I replied, walking past her without a second glance. I walked back into the grand foyer where Calvin was already tapping a silver spoon against his crystal glass, demanding the attention of the room. The murmurs died down, and the crowd gathered around the sweeping staircase. I stood at the edge of the circle, my heart pounding with a strange mixture of dread and anticipation, knowing that whatever my father was about to say would irrevocably alter the foundation of our family forever. Calvin tapped a heavy crystal tumbler with a silver spoon. The sharp ringing cut through the low hum of jazz music and networking chatter. Every head in the grand foyer turned toward the sweeping mahogany staircase where my father stood. I remained at the edge of the crowd, clutching a silver catering tray, while my heart hammered against my ribs. When a son buries his mother, you expect to see grief in his posture. You expect a heavy heart and tear-stained eyes. But as Calvin looked out over the sea of our extended family and Atlanta business elites, he did not look broken. He looked victorious. He adjusted the lapels of his custom-tailored suit and cleared his throat. I want to thank you all for being here to honor the life of my mother. He began, his baritone voice projecting effortlessly across the room. Estelle was a titan in this city. She built an empire from the ground up, turning empty lots into thriving commercial centers. She was a woman of incredible vision and unyielding strength. But as we all know, time takes its toll on even the strongest among us. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Where was he going with this? Grandma Estelle was sharp as a tack until the very last day. She negotiated a commercial lease just 2 weeks before she passed. But Calvin was shaking his head, putting on a masterful performance of a concerned, grieving son. In her final months, her mind was not what it used to be. He continued, letting out a heavy sigh that echoed in the silent room. Because of her declining state, she unfortunately failed to formalize her final estate planning. The lawyers have spent the last few days combing through her files. It breaks my heart to say she forgot to sign a valid, updated will. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. I stopped breathing. The silver tray in my hands felt like it weighed 100 pounds. It was a lie. It was an absolute bold-faced lie. Grandma Estelle never forgot a single detail in her entire life. She was meticulous with her paperwork. We had sat together in her sunroom less than a month ago, drinking sweet tea while she showed me the exact blueprints for the community housing project she was funding through my firm. She told me the assets were secured. Therefore, Calvin said, raising his voice over the rising murmurs, the state defaults the entirety of her estate, her commercial properties, her liquid assets, and this very house directly to me as her only living child. It is a massive burden, but it is a cross I am prepared to bear to protect our bloodline. He paused, letting the reality of his new billionaire status wash over the room. I watched my aunts and uncles exchange greedy, calculated glances. No one challenged him. No one questioned the sudden disappearance of Estelle's infamous legal binders. They all knew whoever controlled the purse strings controlled the family, and Calvin had just declared himself king. But a king needs an heir, Calvin announced, a wide smile breaking across his face. And I refuse to carry this empire alone. It is time for the next generation of men to step up and lead this family into the future. Jamal, come up here, son. The crowd parted as my brother strutted toward the staircase. Jamal wore a smug, self-satisfied grin that made my blood boil. He walked up those steps soaking in the unearned applause of people who knew perfectly well he had bankrupted 3 businesses in the last 5 years. At the bottom of the stairs, his wife Chloe was clapping louder than anyone else. Her diamond bracelets caught the light as she practically vibrated with greed. She looked at the crystal chandeliers and the antique vases as if she were already mentally packing them up to sell. Calvin reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a thick silver ring holding a set of heavy iron skeleton keys. They were the master keys to the main house and the commercial safe deposit boxes, the physical manifestation of decades of black excellence and generational wealth. Calvin placed his hands on Jamal's shoulders and pressed the keys into his palm. Today I am passing the torch, Calvin declared loudly. Jamal will be stepping in as the new head of operations for our family legacy. The injustice of it physically burned my chest. Jamal could not even manage his own checking account without overdraft fees, and now he was being handed the keys to a real estate empire. I thought about the late nights I spent researching sustainable building materials, the grants I fought for the affordable housing units I designed to uplift our community. That was the legacy Grandma Estelle wanted. She told me so herself. I could not stay silent. I refused to be a passive witness to the theft of her life's work. I handed the catering tray to a passing waiter and stepped out from the edge of the crowd. "Hold on," I said. My voice was not loud, but it was steady enough to cut through the applause. The clapping died down instantly. Every face in the foyer turned toward me. Calvin looked down from the 3rd step, his eyes narrowing into dark slits. The height difference was entirely intentional. He wanted me to feel small. "Dad, what about the East Point properties?" I asked, taking another step forward. "What about the Urban Development Trust Grandma and I were finalizing this month?" She explicitly stated those specific assets were being transferred to my firm so we could break ground on the affordable housing initiative. She promised me those properties were secured. The room went dead silent. You could hear the ice shifting in the cocktail glasses. I looked around, hoping for a single ally. Aunt Viv stared at the floor. Cousin Terrence suddenly found his shoes very interesting. The city council members averted their eyes. No one was going to defend the scapegoat against the new billionaire. Calvin let out a short, condescending chuckle that echoed off the marble floors. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disdain. "Maya, you have always been so terribly confused about your place in this family," he said, his tone dripping with patronizing pity. "Your grandmother loved you, yes, but those little charity projects of yours were just her way of humoring you. She knew you did not have the stomach for real business." I felt a hot flush of anger rise in my cheeks, but I stood my ground. "That is not true," I shot back. "She believed in my firm. She knew Jamal was draining this family dry with his crypto scams and failed car rentals." "Watch your mouth," Jamal snapped, stepping forward and gripping the iron keys tightly. "You are just jealous because Grandma finally realized you are nothing but a glorified social worker." Calvin raised a hand to silence Jamal. He looked down at me, his face hardening into a cold, ruthless mask. He leaned over the banister, ensuring his voice carried to every single person in the room. He was not just putting me in my place, he was making an example out of me. "Listen to me very carefully," Maya Calvin said, delivering the words slowly so they would inflict maximum damage. "There are no development trusts. There are no community housing projects. You are not getting the East Point properties. In fact, you won't get a single cent. It is time you learned to stop living in your brother's shadow and fend for yourself." The brutal finality of his words hung in the suffocating air. He had just publicly stripped me of my inheritance, my grandmother's promises, and my dignity in one breath. And the worst part was the sound of Chloe's soft, mocking laughter cutting through the silence from the bottom of the stairs. The heavy silence that followed Calvin's declaration did not last long. The moment the brutal reality of my disinheritance settled over the grand foyer, the guests reacted exactly as I should have expected. They scattered. The so-called elite of Atlanta, the investors, the politicians, the relatives who had just been praising my grandmother's legacy, suddenly found the intricate patterns of the marble floor entirely fascinating. No one met my gaze. I was a sinking ship in a room full of people who only knew how to swim toward the gold. I watched my father turn his back to me, completely dismissing my existence. He signaled to the catering staff to resume passing the hors d'oeuvres, seamlessly transitioning back into the role of the charming host. He picked up his conversation with the city councilman, acting as though he had not just publicly assassinated his own daughter's future. Across the room, Jamal was already holding court. He tossed the heavy iron keys in the air and caught them with a lazy grin, soaking in the congratulations from our sycophantic cousins. The air in the house grew unbearably thin. The scent of white lilies and expensive cologne made my stomach turn. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this house before the suffocating weight of their betrayal forced me to my knees. I kept my chin level and my spine perfectly straight as I navigated through the crowd. People parted for me, parting like water, avoiding a stone, pulling their designer dresses and tailored jackets out of my path. Not a single person offered a word of comfort. I made my way towards the dimly lit vestibule near the front entrance, where the heavy mahogany coat rack stood. I reached out a trembling hand to grab my black wool trench coat. Before my fingers could brush the fabric, a slender manicured hand snatched it off the brass hook. I turned to see Chloe blocking my path. My brother's wife stood there draped in a custom morning dress that looked more suited for a red carpet gala than a funeral. At 31, Chloe wore her new money aesthetic like a weapon. She had married into our family 3 years ago, bringing with her a breathtaking level of entitlement and a constant stream of subtle microaggressions that Calvin and Jamal always eagerly excused. She held my coat against her chest, not offering it to me, but holding it hostage. A sickeningly sweet smile stretched across her pale face, the kind of smile that hit a razor-sharp blade. "Maya, honey," she said, her voice pitched in that quiet, breathy tone designed to make her sound entirely innocent. "You look absolutely exhausted. I suppose today has been quite an ordeal for you, especially with Calvin setting the record straight about the estate." I stared at her, refusing to take the bait. "Just give me my coat, Chloe." She sighed softly, shaking her head with mock sympathy. "It really is a shame about your little community projects. Jamal and I were just talking about that, actually. We both agree it is time to modernize the estate now that he is officially in charge of the properties. The main house needs a total overhaul, of course, but we are starting with the outbuildings." She casually tossed my heavy wool coat at me. I caught it against my chest, the rough fabric grounding me in the moment. "Since you are no longer part of the family trust," Chloe continued, inspecting her diamond ring under the vestibule lighting, "you definitely won't be needing the guest house for your little startup anymore. It is such a beautiful space. The natural light in there is simply to die for. I have already contacted my interior designer. We are going to rip out those dusty old drafting tables and the community maps. I am having custom bamboo flooring installed. It is going to be my new personal hot yoga and Pilates studio. I have been dying for a private sanctuary." My breath caught in my throat. The guest house was not just an office. It was the place where Grandma Estelle and I had spent countless evenings drinking tea and poring over zoning permits. It was where she taught me how to read commercial blueprints. It was the only place on this entire estate where I felt safe, where my vision for sustainable urban housing was nurtured and respected. Chloe was not just taking my workspace. She was actively erasing the last physical sanctuary I shared with my grandmother so she could stretch on a yoga mat. "You are going to gut Grandma Estelle's workspace," I asked, my voice dangerously low. "Oh, Maya, please." Chloe rolled her eyes, letting the sweet facade drop for a fraction of a second. Estelle was a hoarder. Half the stuff in there is useless junk anyway. Jamal is the head of the legacy now. We are cleaning house. Consider this your official notice. You have until Friday morning to clear out your desk and whatever paperwork you want to keep. The demolition contractors arrive at noon sharp, and I do not want your boxes cluttering up the driveway when they get here. My chest burned with a rage so hot and bright it threatened to consume me. The urge to scream, to shatter the antique vase resting on the console table next to me, to grab her by her expensive silk collar and remind her exactly whose blood built the wealth she was currently parading around in was almost unbearable. I wanted to break down. I wanted to demand justice. But then Grandma Estelle's voice echoed in my mind. "Quiet power, Maya. Never let them see you bleed." If I cried, Chloe won. If I raised my voice, Calvin's narrative about me being an unstable, bitter disappointment would be instantly validated. I bit the inside of my cheek, pressing my teeth into the flesh, until I tasted the sharp, metallic tang of copper. I forced my breathing to slow down, channeling every ounce of discipline I possessed to lock the grief and the fury behind a wall of absolute ice. I slid my arms into my trench coat, moving with deliberate, unhurried grace. I smoothed down the lapels, adjusted my collar, and looked Chloe dead in the eyes. I gave her nothing. No tears, no anger, no argument for her to feed on. I looked at her with a profound, empty stillness that made her smile falter and her posture stiffen. "Friday morning," I said, my voice perfectly hollow. "Understood." I turned my back on her and grasped the heavy brass handle of the front door. As I pulled the heavy oak open, the distinct, sharp pop of a champagne cork echoed from the grand foyer behind me. It was immediately followed by Jamal's booming, victorious laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses. They were toasting. They were literally celebrating their theft while the dirt on my grandmother's grave had not even settled. I stepped out onto the wide stone porch, letting the heavy door click shut behind me, severing the sound of their celebration. The muggy evening air wrapped around me, thick with the scent of approaching rain and Georgia pines. I walked down the long, sweeping driveway toward my car, my posture unbroken, my shoulders squared against the encroaching dark. I did not look back at the mansion blazing with light and stolen triumph. I simply walked into the night, swallowing my tears and carrying the burning promise that they had not seen the last of me. The heavy oak door of the main house clicked shut behind me, sealing away the sound of popping champagne and hollow laughter. I walked down the sweeping cobblestone driveway, the humid Georgia night air clinging to my skin. The guest house sat at the far end of the property, partially obscured by a canopy of weeping willows and ancient magnolia trees. For the past 5 years, this carriage house had been my sanctuary, my war room, and the birthplace of my firm. Now it was just another crime scene. I pushed my key into the lock, the familiar metallic click sending a fresh wave of nausea through my stomach. I flipped the light switch and the harsh fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, illuminating my drafting tables, the whiteboards covered in dry erase marker, and the towering stacks of zoning permits. I did not give myself time to sit. I did not give myself time to process the grief of losing Grandma Estelle. If I stopped moving, the reality of being stripped of my legacy would crush my chest. I grabbed a stack of flattened cardboard boxes from the supply closet and began snapping them into shape. The sharp, violent rip of the packing tape echoing off the high ceilings felt oddly therapeutic. I grabbed the edge of my primary drafting table and started sweeping everything into the boxes. Rolled-up blueprints of the East Point Affordable Housing Initiative tumbled into the cardboard. Folded zoning permits, city council meeting notes, environmental impact reports. I shoved them all in without care for organization. My hands were shaking, fueled by a potent cocktail of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated rage. Next were the architectural models. I walked over to the display table holding the miniature replica of the Southside Community Complex. It took me 3 months to build that scale model. Every tiny balsa wood rooftop featured miniature solar panels. Every courtyard had carefully painted green spaces, designed to combat urban food deserts. This was the project Grandma Estelle and I were going to fund together. Chloe wanted to rip this floor up for a hot yoga studio. I grabbed the edge of the heavy plywood base and hoisted the massive model into a plastic crate. The physical exertion made my breath come in ragged gasps. Sweat prickled at my hairline, ruining my black silk morning dress, but I did not care. The physical strain was the only thing keeping my mind from spiraling out of control. I walked over to the gallery wall. This was the wall Grandma Estelle used to stand in front of with her hands on her hips, nodding in silent approval while she reviewed my progress. I reached up and pulled down the first heavy mahogany frame. The glass was cool against my palms. It was the Atlanta City Commendation for Sustainable Urban Development. Next to it was the Green Building Council Excellence Award. I pulled that one down too, feeling the heavy weight of the wood and glass. I stared at the embossed gold lettering, remembering the night I brought these awards into the main house. I had been so proud. I had marched into Calvin's study, hoping just once that he would look at me the way he looked at Jamal. I placed the glass frames right on his massive mahogany desk. Calvin had barely glanced up from his Financial Times. He took a sip of his expensive bourbon, adjusted his reading glasses, and called my life's work a cute little charity project. He told me that sustainable housing was for idealists who did not understand how real money was made. He told me to stop playing social worker and learn how to extract maximum rent from low-income neighborhoods. Real money. That was Calvin's favorite phrase. And who was his shining example of making real money? Jamal. The same Jamal who just 2 months after I won that city commendation convinced Calvin to wire him $250,000 for a guaranteed cryptocurrency startup. Jamal had pitched it as the future of decentralized finance to all of Calvin's wealthy friends. He hosted a lavish launch party at an upscale downtown loft with an open bar and custom ice sculptures completely funded by Calvin. Within 90 days, the token crashed to absolute zero. The developers vanished overnight and the money evaporated into thin air. Did Calvin evict Jamal? Did he cut him off and tell him to fend for himself in front of the entire family? No. Calvin patted his golden boy on the shoulder, poured him a drink, and called it a valuable learning experience. He wrote the $250,000 off as a business expense and bought Jamal a brand new imported sports car to cheer him up. Jamal was allowed to fail spectacularly, repeatedly, and expensively. I was not even allowed to succeed. My victories were minimized, my daily grind was mocked, and my vision was treated as a persistent embarrassment to the family brand. The memory made my vision blur with red-hot anger. I gripped the wooden frame of the city commendation so tightly my knuckles ached. I wanted to smash it against the hardwood floor. I wanted to hear the glass shatter into 1,000 pieces just like my future. Instead, I forced myself to carefully wrap it in a thick layer of bubble wrap and slid it into a box. I would not break my own achievements just because my bloodline refused to value them. I moved to the tall steel filing cabinets, pushing through the exhaustion burning in my thighs and shoulders. Drawer after drawer of vendor contracts, material sourcing contacts, and budget spreadsheets had to be cleared. I hauled the heavy stacks of paper out, dropping them into the cardboard boxes with loud, heavy thuds. Dust coated my fingers and settled in my throat, making me cough in the quiet room. My arms ached, my lower back throbbed relentlessly, but I refused to stop. I had to clear this space completely. I would not leave a single trace of my brilliance for Chloe to casually toss into a dumpster tomorrow morning while she shopped for bamboo flooring. I would not let them erase my footprint that easily. The guest house had been built in the 1920s. It had exposed brick walls and solid iron beams that I had painstakingly restored myself when Grandma Estelle first let me use the space. I had painted the trim, sanded the original hardwood floors, and transformed it from a forgotten storage unit into a high-functioning sanctuary. Every inch of this space held my sweat and my unrelenting ambition. As I dismantled my dual monitor setup and coiled the thick black power cords, I felt like I was dismantling my own body piece by piece. Hours bled into one another, blurring the line between late night and early morning. The digital clock on my desk flashed midnight, then 1 in the morning, then 2. The stack of securely taped cardboard boxes grew higher and higher, forming a brown fortress near the front door. The guest house, once vibrant and alive with the chaotic creative energy of urban planning, was slowly being reduced to a hollow, echoing shell. The empty walls looked bruised, bearing the faded rectangular outlines where my awards and neighborhood project maps used to hang. I wiped a streak of dust and sweat off my forehead with the back of my hand. My muscles were trembling from the sheer physical output. I stood in the center of the stripped room, listening to the heavy, oppressive silence. The main house across the expansive lawn had finally gone dark. Calvin, Jamal, and Chloe were likely fast asleep in their luxury suites, dreaming of the sprawling empire they had just stolen. They were resting peacefully on the arrogant assurance that they had finally broken the family scapegoat once and for all. I looked down at my hands, calloused from hauling boxes and stained with black printer ink. They thought I was going to crawl away quietly into the night. They thought taking this office and cutting me off from the estate would finally break my spirit. They vastly underestimated how long I had been fighting just to exist in this family, and they had no idea what I was capable of building from the ground up. The heavy, oppressive silence of the stripped guest house was suddenly shattered by 3 sharp, deliberate knocks at the front door. The sound cracked like a gunshot in the quiet room. I froze, my hand still gripping the edges of a packing box. It was past 2 in the morning. The main house had been dark for hours. No one in my family would bother knocking politely at this time of night. If Calvin wanted to deliver another lecture, he would have sent a text. If Jamal wanted to gloat, he would have barged right in. If Chloe wanted to inspect the property, she would have waited for daylight. My heart rate spiked, but the exhaustion quickly gave way to a cold, hard defensive instinct. I was not going to be intimidated in my own workspace. I reached over to my dismantled drafting table and picked up a heavy, solid brass architectural compass, holding it firmly at my side. I squared my shoulders, walked across the scuffed hardwood floor, and pulled open the heavy wooden door. Standing on my porch, bathed in the dim yellow glow of the security light, was a man I had never seen before. He was strikingly tall, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. He wore a meticulously tailored midnight blue suit that looked completely untouched by the suffocating Atlanta humidity. His crisp white shirt and dark silk tie were immaculate, contrasting sharply with my dust-covered morning dress and ink-stained hands. He was an African-American man in his early 40s, with sharp, discerning eyes that seemed to instantly assess everything about me and the hollowed-out room behind me in a single glance. He held a slim black leather briefcase in his left hand. "Maya," he said, his voice deep, smooth, and entirely professional. "I apologize for the late hour, but time is of the essence. May I come in?" I did not step aside. I tightened my grip on the brass compass. "Who are you, and what are you doing on this property? The estate is closed to guests." He offered a small, knowing smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He did not look at the brass compass in my hand, clearly unbothered by my defensive posture. "My name is Elias Sterling. I am a corporate attorney based out of Chicago. And technically speaking, this estate is not entirely closed to me. I have been sitting in a vehicle down the street for the past 6 hours waiting for the main house to go dark. I needed to ensure Calvin and Jamal were completely out of the picture before I made my approach." The casual mention of my father and brother sent a shockwave of adrenaline through my system. "How do you know my family?" I demanded, stepping perfectly into the center of the doorway to block his view. "Are you one of Calvin's new associates? Because if he sent you here to intimidate me into leaving before Friday, you can tell him to save his breath." "I am already packing. I do not work for Calvin," Elias replied, his tone dropping an octave, vibrating with a quiet, intense respect. "I work for Estelle." My grandmother's name hung in the humid night air. I felt the breath leave my lungs. I loosened my grip on the brass tool, my defensive wall cracking just a fraction. Grandma Estelle passed away. She does not have any active attorneys. Calvin made that very clear in the foyer tonight. Calvin only knows what your grandmother allowed him to know, Elias said smoothly. Estelle was a brilliant strategist. She knew her local Atlanta lawyers were too thoroughly embedded in your father's social circles to be trusted with her true intentions. She knew Calvin played golf with the senior partners at her old firm. That is precisely why 5 years ago, she quietly reached out to my firm in Chicago. She needed a shark from outside the local fishbowl. She needed someone who was completely immune to Calvin's influence and Jamal's entitlement. May I please come in, Maya? What I have to share with you cannot be discussed on an open porch. I stared into his eyes, searching for any sign of deception. There was none. There was only a fierce, unwavering professionalism. I took a step back and opened the door wider, allowing him to cross the threshold. Elias stepped into the center of the guest house. The harsh fluorescent lights illuminated the towering fortress of brown cardboard boxes, the bare brick walls, and the empty filing cabinets. He slowly surveyed the room, taking in the sheer volume of my packed-away life. He looked at the heavy plastic crate holding my Southside Community Complex model and the carefully bubble-wrapped city commendations resting on top of a box. I see they did not waste a single second, he murmured, his voice carrying a trace of genuine disgust. I expected Calvin to move quickly to secure his position, but demanding you vacate your own firm's headquarters by Friday is exceptionally aggressive, even for him. I assume Chloe had a hand in this. How could you possibly know about Chloe? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I closed the front door, making sure the deadbolt clicked into place. Elias set his sleek leather briefcase down on the only remaining clear surface of my drafting table. Estelle and I spoke weekly for the past 5 years, he explained, turning to face me. She kept me highly informed about the family dynamics. She told me about Jamal burning through hundreds of thousands of dollars on ridiculous cryptocurrency ventures. She told me about Chloe's insatiable greed. She told me about Calvin's blind spot for his son and his relentless need to diminish your accomplishments to protect his own ego. Tears pricked the back of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. She saw all of it. I asked, my voice trembling slightly. She knew how they treated me. She knew every single detail, Elias said, his expression softening with a profound respect, and it infuriated her. Estelle told me you had concrete in your spine, Maya. She watched you build this urban development firm from the ground up without taking a single dime of family money. She watched you fight for city zoning permits while your brother begged for bailouts. She knew exactly who you were, but more importantly, she knew exactly who Calvin was. Elias unlatched the brass clasps of his briefcase. The sharp clicks echoed loudly in the empty room. She anticipated exactly what Calvin would do today. Elias continued, his hands moving deliberately inside the dark leather case. Estelle knew that the moment her heart stopped beating, Calvin would attempt to seize total control of the narrative. She predicted he would stand in front of the extended family and claim she simply forgot to write a will. She knew he would use the default state inheritance laws to legally absorb the estate and bypass you entirely. He actually did it! I whispered, the sickening reality of my father's calculated performance in the grand foyer washing over me again. He stood on those stairs and told everyone she just slipped into cognitive decline and forgot to sign the papers. He crowned Jamal, the heir, right in front of me. And that, Elias said, looking up with a razor-sharp smile, is exactly why I had to wait in my car until now. Estelle's entire strategy depended on Calvin committing to that lie in public. She needed his hubris to blind him. She needed him to formally declare himself the uncontested owner of her assets in front of the city council, the investors, and the family. She needed him to feel completely victorious, so he would let his guard down. Elias pulled his hands out of the briefcase. He held a thick, heavy manila envelope. It was not a standard legal mailer. It was bound with a thick silk ribbon and sealed in the center with a large circle of deep crimson wax. Stamped perfectly into the hardened red wax was the unmistakable crest of an interlocking E and H. It was Grandma Estelle's personal vintage monogram seal, the very same one she used to stamp her private correspondence when I was a little girl. Seeing that seal broke something open inside my chest. It was a message from the grave, a lifeline thrown across the void by the only person who had ever truly loved me. "What is that?" I asked. My eyes locked on the crimson wax. My hands started to shake. Elias stepped closer, bridging the distance between us. He held the heavy envelope out, extending it toward me with the reverence of someone handing over a crown. "This is the culmination of 5 years of absolute secrecy," Elias said, his voice low and vibrating with intensity. "This is the fail-safe your grandmother constructed to ensure that her legacy would never be squandered by arrogant men who do not know the value of hard work. Calvin thinks he won today. He thinks he stripped you of your power and banished you to the shadows. But Estelle made sure that the shadows are exactly where you strike from." I slowly reached out and took the envelope. It was incredibly heavy, containing dozens of pages of thick legal parchment. The crimson wax seal felt cool and solid beneath my fingertips. I looked up from the envelope, meeting Elias's sharp, unyielding gaze. He leaned in slightly, the ambient light catching the determination in his eyes. "It is time to tell them who you really are." My fingers trembled as I traced the raised edges of the crimson wax. The interlocking letters E and H stared back at me, carrying the weight of my grandmother's entire existence. I slipped my thumb under the flap of the heavy envelope and broke the seal. The sharp snap of the brittle wax echoed in the empty guest house, sounding like the opening shot of a war I had not known I was fighting. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. The parchment was heavy, covered in dense typed text and notarized stamps. I flipped to the first page, expecting to see the header of a last will and testament. Instead, the bold black lettering at the top read, "Articles of Incorporation and Operating Agreement." Beneath that was the name Estelle Holdings, LLC. I looked up at Elias, my brow furrowed in confusion. "I do not understand," I said. "Grandma Estelle never ran an LLC. Everything she owned was in her personal name. The estate, the commercial strip malls, the bank accounts. Calvin used to complain constantly about how old-fashioned she was with her asset management." Elias offered a sharp, appreciative smile. That is exactly what she wanted Calvin to think. Estelle was old-fashioned in her manners, but she was ruthlessly modern in her strategy. She knew that if she simply wrote a traditional will leaving the bulk of her assets to you, Calvin would contest it the moment her heart stopped beating. He would drag you through Fulton County probate court for the next 20 years, draining the estate with legal fees just to bleed you dry out of pure spite. Elias stepped forward and tapped a manicured finger against the second page of the document in my hands. "So 5 years ago, she bypassed the probate courts entirely. We quietly established a blind corporate trust. Over the course of 36 months, Estelle systematically transferred the deeds to every single piece of property she owned into Estelle Holdings, LLC. The historic estate across the lawn, the East Point commercial districts, the offshore bank accounts. Every asset was moved under the corporate umbrella." My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the list of properties attached in the appendix. He was right. Every single address, every account number was listed here under the ownership of the LLC. So when Calvin stood on those stairs tonight, I whispered, my mind racing to catch up to the sheer brilliance of the trap my grandmother had set. When he told everyone that she forgot to sign a will and the state defaulted her assets to him. He was technically correct, Elias said, his eyes gleaming with professional satisfaction. She did die without a personal will, and the state did default her personal assets to him as her only living son. But her personal assets consisted of a checking account with about $4,000 in it and a 10-year-old luxury sedan. That is the entirety of Calvin's grand inheritance. He just crowned himself the king of an empty shell. He inherited a ghost. I stared down at the paperwork, the reality of the situation sending a massive rush of adrenaline through my veins. "Look at page 12, Elias instructed, his voice dropping to a serious, commanding tone. "Look at the succession protocol." I flipped through the heavy parchment, my hands no longer trembling. I found the section titled Executive Succession and Shareholder Transfer. I read the legal jargon, my eyes scanning the dense paragraphs until I hit the highlighted clause. Upon the death of the founding member, all controlling shares and executive authority immediately transfer to the designated successor. And right beneath that clause, printed in bold black ink, was my name. Maya Renee Vance, majority shareholder and sole chief executive officer of Estelle Holdings, LLC. I am the CEO. I said the words feeling foreign and heavy on my tongue. You are the sole legal owner of an empire valued at over $200 million, Elias corrected gently. Calvin does not own the mansion he is currently sleeping in. Jamal does not own the commercial properties he intends to leverage. Chloe does not have the legal right to change a single light bulb in this guest house, let alone gut it for a yoga studio. The iron keys Calvin handed your brother tonight belong to doors that you legally own. They are standing on your ground, Maya. The profound weight of my grandmother's love hit me like a physical blow. She had seen me. She had seen all of the late nights, the struggles, the way Calvin dismissed my ambition, and Jamal mocked my work ethic. She had watched them try to break me, and she had quietly, systematically built an impenetrable fortress around my future. She did not just leave me an inheritance, she gave me a loaded weapon. Elias reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a sleek silver pen. He held it out to me. All I need is your signature on the acceptance forms, he said. The moment you sign, the transfer of power is officially documented on the corporate level. From there, we can move as swiftly as you desire. I have a team of litigators standing by in Chicago ready to file an emergency injunction in the Atlanta courts the moment they open. I can have a judge freeze every asset Calvin thinks he controls by 8 in the morning. I can have the county sheriff at the front gates of the main house by noon tomorrow with a formal eviction notice for your father, brother, and sister-in-law. We can end their billionaire fantasy before breakfast. I took the silver pen from his hand. The metal was cool and heavy. I looked down at the signature line on the acceptance form. I thought about how easy it would be to ruin their Friday morning. I thought about the look of absolute terror that would cross Calvin's face when the sheriff handed him an eviction notice. I thought about Chloe being dragged out of the mansion in her designer pajamas, her dreams of a private yoga studio crushed under the boot of legal reality. It was a tempting thought. The immediate gratification of walking across the lawn tomorrow and watching them realize they had nothing. But then I looked around the stripped guest house. I looked at the cardboard boxes holding the remnants of my firm. I remembered the sound of the champagne cork popping in the foyer. I remembered Jamal catching those iron keys with that smug, unearned grin. I remembered Calvin standing on the staircase making an absolute spectacle of my disinheritance, using my pain as a punchline for his wealthy friends. Immediate eviction was too clean. It was too fast. If I threw them out tomorrow, they would just play the victims. Calvin would spin a narrative to his country club friends about how his greedy, estranged daughter used corporate loopholes to steal his grieving mother's house. Jamal would cry to his investors that he was robbed of his rightful legacy. They would learn absolutely nothing. I signed my name on the acceptance form, my signature bold and decisive. I handed the paper back to Elias. File the corporate transfer so it is legally binding, I said. But do not file the injunction. Do not send the sheriff. Do not freeze the accounts yet. Elias paused, slipping the document into his briefcase. He looked at me with a raised eyebrow, a mixture of surprise and professional curiosity. You want to let them stay in the house. You want Chloe to think she successfully evicted you from your own property. I want them to feel comfortable, I replied, leaning against the edge of my drafting table. I want Calvin to believe his own lies. I want Jamal to walk into rooms thinking he is a real estate tycoon. I want Chloe to start hiring contractors to rip up these floors. Because right now, they are arrogant. And arrogant people make careless, expensive mistakes. Elias's lips curved into a sharp, predatory smile. He snapped his briefcase shut. You want to give them enough rope to hang themselves. Exactly, I said. Calvin raised Jamal to believe there are no consequences for his actions. He bailed him out of every failed business and covered every bounced check. If they think they suddenly have access to hundreds of millions of dollars in generational wealth, they are not going to sit quietly on the porch. Jamal is going to spend money he does not actually have. He is going to leverage properties he does not actually own. And Calvin is going to sign off on every single fraudulent move because he is too proud to admit his golden child is a liability. I looked at the stack of boxes by the door. I will clear out my desk just like Chloe asked. I will move my firm to a cheap, cramped office downtown. I will play the part of the defeated, broken sister perfectly. I will let them throw their parties and buy their luxury cars. I will let them build their house of cards as high as possible. Because when I finally pull the bottom card out, I do not just want them to lose the house. I want them to lose everything. Elias picked up his briefcase, his posture radiating absolute respect. He gave a brief formal nod. Estelle told me you were a master architect, Maya. She said you knew exactly how to dismantle a weak foundation. I will keep the corporate veil completely secure. The public registry will only show a blind trust in Chicago. They will never see you coming until it is far too late. I will monitor their financial movements from our end and document every single transaction Jamal attempts to make against the LLC's assets. When the time comes to strike, we will have an airtight federal case. Thank you, Elias, I said. And thank you for protecting her vision. It is the honor of my career, he replied. He walked toward the front door, stepping carefully around the packed boxes of my life's work. Before he crossed the threshold, he looked back over his shoulder. I will be in touch. Madam CEO. The heavy oak door closed behind him, leaving me alone in the fluorescent light of the guest house. The silence no longer felt oppressive. It felt pregnant with possibility. I looked down at my dust-covered morning dress and my ink-stained hands. I was exhausted, my body aching from hauling boxes and battling grief. But deep in my chest, a new fire was burning steady and unquenchable. I walked over to the nearest box, grabbed a roll of packing tape, and ripped off a long piece. The loud, violent sound echoed off the high ceilings, but this time it did not sound like defeat. It sounded like the opening notes of a long overdue reckoning. I was going to pack my bags. I was going to let them celebrate their stolen crown. But the countdown had officially begun, and they were blindly marching straight into the trap. The transition from the sprawling guest house to my new office was swift and brutal. I found a cramped 400-square-foot space above a noisy deli in downtown Atlanta. The rent was cheap, and the location was loud, but it was mine. I spent the first few days hauling my boxes up 2 flights of narrow stairs, my muscles screaming in protest. The space smelled faintly of pastrami and old coffee, but I threw open the single window, letting in the chaotic energy of the city streets below. I set up my drafting tables against the exposed brick wall, unpacking my blueprints and models with meticulous care. I hung my city commendations and green building awards not as decorative pieces, but as stark reminders of exactly what I was fighting to protect. The quiet luxury of Grandma Estelle's estate was gone, replaced by the constant rumble of delivery trucks and sirens. But sitting at my desk, surrounded by the tangible evidence of my hard work, I felt an unprecedented level of focus. While I was adjusting to the noise of downtown Jamal, and Chloe were busy adjusting to what they believed was a $200 million lifestyle. Their descent into unchecked arrogance was spectacular and entirely predictable. I watched the tragedy unfold in real time, largely through Chloe's meticulously curated social media accounts. Her daily posts became a masterclass in new money excess. The first week, she posted a video of a brand new matte black imported sports car being unloaded from a flatbed truck right in the middle of Grandma Estelle's pristine circular driveway. The caption read, "A little early anniversary present for the new king of Atlanta real estate. #generational wealth." A few days later, a series of glossy, highly filtered photos appeared showing Chloe and Jamal boarding a first-class flight to Paris. They documented every expensive meal, every luxury hotel suite, and every designer shopping spree along the Champs-Élysées. They were burning through cash at an astonishing rate. The gossip in the Atlanta business community confirmed what the photos suggested. My contacts in urban planning and commercial real estate were calling me, asking concerned questions about Jamal's sudden erratic behavior. "I heard your brother just dropped $100,000 on a table at that new charity gala," an old colleague told me over coffee one morning. He was bragging about expanding the family portfolio into international resorts. Maya, is he actually running things now? I sipped my coffee, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression. Calvin is managing the transition, I said smoothly, sticking to the script Elias and I had agreed upon. Jamal is exploring new avenues. The colleague raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. Well, he is certainly exploring the bottom of some very expensive bottles of champagne. Back at the estate, the spending spree was reaching absurd levels. Chloe began hosting extravagant weekend dinners catering to the city's most superficial socialites. She hired private chefs, imported rare seafood, and converted the elegant formal dining room into what looked like a VIP lounge at a nightclub. She even posted a time-lapse video of a demolition crew gutting the guest house, ripping up the historic hardwood floors to make way for her custom yoga studio. Watching the destruction of my former sanctuary through a glowing screen should have hurt. Instead, it only solidified my resolve. Every wall they knocked down, every luxury car they purchased was another nail in their inevitable coffin. They were behaving exactly as I knew they would, drunk on power they did not possess, spending money they did not legally own. I kept my head down and focused entirely on my work. I finalized the blueprints for the Southside Community Complex, pushing forward with the affordable housing initiative Grandma Estelle and I had envisioned. I worked 14-hour days fueled by cheap deli coffee and the cold, hard certainty that a reckoning was coming. Elias called me precisely once a week, providing clipped professional updates on the corporate side of things. He was a ghost in the machine, tracking every financial movement, monitoring every erratic decision Calvin and Jamal made. They are moving fast, Maya, he told me during our third weekly check-in. The arrogance is blinding them completely. Calvin is introducing Jamal to all the major players, but he is letting Jamal take the lead on the spending. They think the estate's equity is an endless well. Let them dig, I replied, staring at the framed city commendation on my wall. Just let me know when they hit rock bottom. The waiting was the hardest part. Living in the cramped office, grinding through daily meetings and permit applications, while my family paraded around as billionaires, required a level of discipline I did not know I possessed. I had to force myself to smile when former associates offered me pitying looks. I had to swallow the bile when I saw Chloe's posts claiming she was renovating the estate to reflect a more modern aesthetic. They were so incredibly comfortable in their delusion. They believed they had won the war without a single casualty. They thought I was crushed, defeated, and erased from the legacy. But sitting in my tiny office, listening to the rumble of the city below, I knew the truth. They had not erased me. They had simply handed me the matches and pointed me toward the gasoline. The illusion of grandeur was intoxicating them, but the hangover was going to be absolutely devastating. I grabbed my red pen and leaned over a fresh set of blueprints circling a structural flaw in a building design. You cannot build a skyscraper on a foundation of sand, I whispered to the empty room. It will always eventually collapse. And I was going to ensure that when Calvin, Jamal, and Chloe finally fell, the impact would be loud enough for the entire city to hear. I just needed to wait for them to make the one fatal mistake that would bring the whole house of cards crashing down. The phone on my desk rang, shattering the silence. I glanced at the caller ID. It was Elias. He rarely called outside of our scheduled weekly updates. I picked up the receiver, my pulse quickening. Elias, is everything all right? Maya, he said, his voice tight with a dangerous electric energy. They just made the move. The trap is officially sprung. What did they do? I asked, gripping the edge of my desk. Elias let out a sharp, humorless laugh. They just tried to leverage the estate. Jamal, backed by Calvin's signature, just secured a massive high-interest predatory loan. They used the main house and the East Point commercial properties as collateral. The breath left my lungs. They used properties they do not legally own to secure a loan. I confirmed the reality of their massive catastrophic error settling over me. Exactly, Elias said. It is textbook financial fraud, and the paperwork has Calvin's and Jamal's signatures all over it. We have them, Maya. We have them completely dead to rights. I looked out the window at the bustling Atlanta streets. The noise, the chaos, the struggle of the past few weeks suddenly felt entirely worth it. The trap was set, the bait was taken. Now all I had to do was wait for the jaws to snap shut. "How much did they take?" I asked, my voice dropping to a deadly calm whisper. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, turning away from the window and pacing the short length of my cramped office. $4.5 million, Elias replied. The exact figure hung in the air, heavy and absolute. It is a hard money bridge loan. The kind of predatory short-term financing that carries exorbitant double-digit interest rates. You only sign paperwork like this if you are entirely desperate or entirely stupid. Jamal, as we both know, happens to be a dangerous combination of both. I stopped pacing and leaned against my drafting table. How did they even get it approved? I demanded, my mind racing through the logistics of commercial lending. Any standard bank would require a rigorous title search. They would need the operating agreement of Estelle Holdings to prove ownership. They cannot just walk into a Bank of America and hand over the deed to a historic estate they do not own. They did not use a standard bank, Elias explained, his tone dripping with professional disdain. Calvin knows better than to subject himself to a federal underwriter right now. He used an old connection, a private equity lending firm run by a few of his associates at the country club. It is the classic Atlanta old boys network at play. They relied entirely on Calvin's long-standing social reputation and the highly publicized assumption of his inheritance. The lenders bypassed standard due diligence to expedite the cash transfer for a friend. Calvin vouched for Jamal as the new head of the family legacy, and they simply forged an affidavit of title claiming the estate was free and clear under Calvin's direct ownership. A cold, sharp laugh escaped my throat. They forged an affidavit of title. They actually put their signatures on fraudulent documents and handed them to a private equity firm? Elias let out a breath that sounded like a sigh of pure predatory satisfaction. Jamal signed as the primary borrower. Calvin signed as the primary guarantor. They leveraged a corporate asset they have absolutely zero legal claim to and pledged it as collateral for a cash injection. Maya. They did not just make a financial mistake. They committed bank fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud a lending institution. This is not a civil dispute over a family will anymore. This is a federal crime. The gravity of his words settled over me, wrapping around my shoulders like a heavy iron cloak. Grandma Estelle had predicted their greed, but even she might have been stunned by the sheer velocity of their arrogance. They had the estate for less than a month, and they were already mortgaging it to fund luxury cars and designer vacations. I looked up at the wall above my desk where my city commendations hung. I had spent a decade calculating budgets down to the last cent, fighting for community grants that barely covered construction costs. I knew the value of $1 because I had to bleed for every single one of them. Jamal and Calvin viewed money as an infinite resource that magically replenished itself simply because they existed. "Where is the money now?" I asked, keeping my focus sharp. "The funds were wired into a joint checking account yesterday morning." Elias answered, the sound of keyboard keys clacking in the background as he verified the data. "And they are already burning through it. Based on the routing activity I am tracking, they cleared $100,000 in the last 24 hours alone. I suspect that covers the imported sports car Chloe has been parading on social media and the deposit for their upcoming European trip." "Are you securing the paper trail?" I asked. "I have every single document," Elias assured me. "I have the signed loan origination files, the forged affidavit of title, the wire transfer receipts, and the routing numbers. My team in Chicago is quietly building an airtight, comprehensive dossier. We are compiling everything the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission will need to secure a grand jury indictment. But I am keeping it completely sealed until you give me the green light. Calvin and Jamal have absolutely no idea they are operating inside a glass box." I closed my eyes, taking a slow, deep breath of the stale office air. The scent of the deli downstairs mingled with the faint metallic smell of the printing ink on my desk. It was not glamorous. It was not a sprawling historic mansion. But it was honest. Every square inch of my current struggle was grounded in reality. Meanwhile, my father and brother were currently dancing on a trapdoor with a noose wrapped tightly around their necks. Hold the files, I instructed, my voice steady and unwavering. Do not flag the lender. Do not alert the authorities yet. Let the wire transfers clear. Let them spend the money. Elias paused, a hint of caution entering his voice. Maya, you understand that the more they spend, the deeper the financial hole they create. That 4.5 million is technically a liability taken out against your holding company. It is a fraudulent liability issued without the consent of the sole corporate officer, I countered, matching his legal precision. When we drop the hammer, the private equity firm will have to write it off as a total loss due to their own negligence in failing to perform a basic title search. The LLC is perfectly insulated. Let them spend every single cent of that 4.5 million, Elias. I want them to buy the clothes. I want them to throw the parties. I want them to get entirely comfortable living a life funded by federal wire fraud. Because when I finally drag them into the light, I do not want them to just lose the estate. I want them facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Understood, Elias replied, the respect in his voice ringing loud and clear. I will continue to monitor the accounts and update the fraud dossier daily. We will let them gorge themselves on the bait. I will speak to you next week, Madam CEO. The line clicked dead. I lowered my phone to the desk and stared blankly at the brick wall in front of me. The magnitude of what had just happened was staggering. My family had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them permanently. They had been so eager to push me out, so desperate to erase my presence from the family legacy that they sprinted blindly into a minefield. I sat down in my worn office chair, resting my hands flat on the cool surface of my drafting table. For the first time since Grandma Estelle's funeral, I felt a profound, undeniable sense of peace. The rage that had been burning a hole in my chest for weeks began to cool, hardening into something much more dangerous. It was no longer a frantic, desperate anger. It was calculated, it was patient. I picked up my red drafting pen and turned back to the blueprints for the Southside Community Complex. I had an affordable housing project to build. I had contractors to interview and city zoning boards to navigate. I was going to continue doing the hard, unglamorous work of building a true legacy. Let Calvin and Jamal play their games. Let Chloe buy her designer shoes with stolen money. They were living on borrowed time and I held the stopwatch. I just had to maintain my cover as the struggling, defeated scapegoat for a little while longer. I would play my part perfectly until the stage was set for the final act. 3 days after my phone call with Elias, I was standing over my drafting table, entirely consumed by the soil analysis reports for the Southside Community Complex. The rhythmic thumping of the deli meat slicer on the floor below sent a constant vibration up through my boots, but I had already learned to tune it out. I was calculating the drainage gradients when the frosted glass door of my office swung open. There was no knock. There was only the sharp, arrogant click of designer stilettos on my scuffed wooden floor. I did not have to look up to know who had just invaded my space. The heavy scent of an obnoxiously expensive perfume instantly overpowered the faint smell of pastrami and old coffee that permanently lingered in my office. I set down my red pen and straightened my spine before turning around. Chloe stood in the center of my cramped 400-square-foot office, looking like she had just stepped off a Parisian runway. She was draped in a pristine white tweed suit, carrying a brand-new crocodile leather handbag that cost more than most of my contractors made in a year. Massive diamond studs sparkled at her ears, catching the harsh fluorescent lighting of my workspace. She looked entirely out of place, a walking, breathing billboard for the $4.5 million of stolen equity she was currently burning through. Oh, Maya, she sighed, raising a perfectly manicured hand to her nose, as if the very air in my office was offensive to her. Wow, it is so incredibly quaint in here. I honestly do not know how you manage to breathe in this tiny little box. I leaned back against my drafting table, crossing my arms over my chest. I kept my face perfectly neutral, giving her absolutely nothing to feed on. Hello, Chloe. What brings you to this side of town? I highly doubt you came all the way down here just to critique my ventilation. Chloe let out a breathy, patronizing little laugh. She began pacing around my small office, running a finger over the edge of my filing cabinet and inspecting the dust on her fingertip with a grimace. She stopped in front of my scaled architectural model for the Affordable Housing Initiative, peering down at it like it was a middle school science fair project. I just had to see it for myself, Chloe said, turning to face me with a look of overwhelming manufactured pity. Jamal told me you moved into this rundown neighborhood, but I could not picture it. It really puts things into perspective. You truly have to hustle, do you not? Every single day, just fighting for scraps from the city council, begging for grants. It must be so completely exhausting to live like that. I maintained steady, unbroken eye contact. I enjoy the work, Chloe. It has purpose. She waved her hand dismissively, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking together. That is a very sweet way to look at it. I admire your grit, Maya, I really do. It is a very specific kind of struggle. But Jamal and I were just talking over breakfast this morning about how incredibly blessed we are. Stepping into the role of managing the family legacy, it is a heavy responsibility, of course. But having real generational wealth gives us the freedom to focus on the big picture. We do not have to grind ourselves to the bone just to survive. The absolute audacity of her words was almost mesmerizing. She was standing in front of me, a white woman who had married into my family 3 years ago, lecturing me about generational wealth while wearing shoes purchased with a fraudulent loan taken out against a corporate trust that I legally owned. She was parading my grandmother's legacy in my face, completely oblivious to the fact that I was the sole architect of the trap she was currently dancing in. I am sure Jamal is handling the big picture perfectly, I said, my voice smooth and devoid of any sarcasm. He always did have a vivid imagination. Chloe's smile tightened just a fraction, her eyes flashing with a brief hint of irritation, before she smoothed her features back into a mask of sweet superiority. Actually, that brings me to why I am here. Jamal is taking his new role very seriously. He has been auditing the estate's finances all week, and we noticed a rather significant discrepancy regarding your use of the guest house over the past 5 years. She opened her expensive handbag and pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope. She held it out, holding it between her index and middle fingers as if handing a citation to a subordinate. We realized that Estelle let you essentially squat on the property rent-free, Chloe explained, her tone dropping into a mock business cadence. While that was very generous of her, Jamal is modernizing the portfolio now. We have to square away all outstanding debts to bring the estate's ledgers up to date. Calvin completely agreed with us. I reached out and took the envelope. It was sealed with a generic gold sticker, a cheap imitation of my grandmother's crimson wax. I slid my thumb under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of heavy cardstock. It was an invoice printed on a brand new letterhead that read, Jamal Vance Real Estate Holdings. I scanned the document, my eyes landing on the bold figure at the bottom of the page. It was a backdated bill for $50,000 listed as retroactive commercial lease compensation for my use of the guest house. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. The sheer monumental stupidity of this piece of paper was staggering. Jamal had just secured a $4.5 million cash injection less than a week ago, and they were already shaking me down for $50,000. It told me everything I needed to know about how recklessly they were hemorrhaging money. The sports cars, the private flights, the daily luxury shopping sprees, they were burning through the principal of that predatory loan so fast they were already scrambling for pocket change to cover their lifestyle inflation. And from a legal standpoint, Jamal had just handed me a physical piece of evidence proving he was attempting to extort money for a property he did not hold the title to. It was literal mail fraud stacked on top of federal bank fraud. $50,000, I said, keeping my voice quiet, injecting just enough forced hesitation into my tone to make her think I was panicked. Chloe, this is backdated for 5 years. I do not have $50,000 in liquid capital just sitting around to hand over to Jamal. Chloe's smile returned radiant and victorious. She took a step closer, practically vibrating with the thrill of having the upper hand. I know it is a lot for your little startup to absorb, Maya, she purred, reaching out to pat my shoulder with false sympathy. But business is business. We are booking a private yacht charter in Monaco for the end of the summer, and Jamal is aggressively restructuring our liquid assets to prepare for the trip. We need that invoice cleared by the end of the month. I looked down at the fraudulent piece of paper in my hands, making sure my shoulders slumped just a fraction. I played the part of the defeated broken sister flawlessly. I will have to figure out a payment plan, I said, my voice sounding appropriately hollow. I need time. Of course you will figure it out, Chloe said, turning toward the door with a triumphant swish of her white tweed skirt. You are a strong, independent woman, Maya. You are used to the hustle. Just make sure the first check clears by next Friday. She opened the frosted glass door and stepped out into the narrow hallway, the sharp click of her heels retreating down the stairs. The heavy scent of her perfume lingered in the room, completely failing to mask the stench of her overwhelming arrogance. I stood alone in my cramped office, staring at the invoice. I did not feel defeated. I felt a profound, icy anticipation. I walked over to my desk, picked up my phone, and took a clear, high-resolution photograph of the fraudulent bill. I sent it directly to Elias Sterling in Chicago with a single sentence attached. Add it to the federal dossier. Friday morning arrived with the heavy, humid heat that Atlanta was famous for. I sat at my drafting table in the cramped downtown office, staring at the blank company checkbook resting in front of me. Writing this check felt entirely counterintuitive to every survival instinct I possessed. My pride screamed at me to tear Chloe's fraudulent invoice into confetti, to drive up to the estate and throw it directly in her face. But Grandma Estelle did not build an empire on pride. She built it on strategy. She taught me that sometimes you have to let your enemies think they are winning, so they walk blindly into the snare. I carefully uncapped my black pen. I wrote out the sum of $5,000 payable directly to Jamal. In the memo line, I wrote something highly specific, exactly as Elias had instructed. I wrote installment 1 of 10 for retroactive guest house lease agreement. That single sentence was the tripwire. It was not just a memo. It was a legally binding classification of the funds. I tore the check from the ledger and slid it into a crisp white envelope. I did not mail it. Mailing it would give them too much distance. I wanted to hand it to Chloe directly. I wanted to look her in the eye and give her the performance of a lifetime. I drove my practical sedan out of the gritty, bustling downtown district and up toward the sprawling, affluent neighborhoods where the estate was located. The contrast between my reality and their stolen fantasy was jarring. As I approached the massive wrought iron gates of the property, I pressed the intercom button. The gate slowly swung open, revealing a scene that made my jaw clench. The driveway was littered with commercial contractor vans. They were already tearing up the beautiful decades-old azalea bushes that Grandma Estelle had meticulously planted along the perimeter. A massive dumpster sat on the pristine lawn, overflowing with the original heart pine floorboards they had ripped out of the guest house. The sheer violent disrespect of it all burned in my chest, but I locked that anger away deep behind a wall of absolute ice. I parked my car, walked up the wide marble steps, and rang the heavy brass doorbell. Chloe opened the door before the chime even finished echoing through the foyer. She was flanked by a frantic-looking interior designer holding a massive binder of fabric swatches. Chloe wore a sweeping silk robe that easily cost more than my monthly office rent, holding a ceramic mug of an expensive matcha latte. She looked down at me from the elevated threshold, an expression of triumphant satisfaction blooming across her pale face. "Maya," she purred, taking a slow sip of her drink. "You actually came. I was beginning to think we would have to send Calvin's lawyers down to that little neighborhood you work in now." I let my shoulders slump just a fraction, physically diminishing my presence. I softened my voice, injecting it with a manufactured layer of exhaustion and defeat. I pulled the white envelope from my purse and held it out to her. "It is $5,000, Chloe." I said, my tone flat and beaten. "It is all the liquid capital I can pull from the firm's operating accounts right now. I had to delay a vendor payment just to make this happen. Please tell Jamal I will have the rest next month. I just need a little more time to balance my ledgers." Chloe took the envelope, slipping her perfectly manicured finger under the flap to inspect the check. She looked at the amount and let out a sharp, patronizing sigh. She shook her head, acting as if my struggle was a personal inconvenience to her. Only 5,000, she clicked her tongue in mock sympathy. Maya Jamal is going to be so incredibly disappointed. I know it is difficult for someone in your position to grasp how high-level commercial real estate works, but we have massive overhead now. The carrying costs on an estate of this magnitude are astronomical. We simply cannot afford to subsidize your past mistakes forever. She looked me up and down, taking in my practical work clothes, before offering a sickeningly sweet smile. But I will talk to him. I will tell him you are trying your absolute best with the limited resources you have. Maybe Jamal can even offer you some consulting advice on how to scale your little business so you do not have to struggle so hard. You really should learn to lean on your brother's expertise. I nodded meekly, swallowing my pride like broken glass. I fed her exactly the narrative she craved. Thank you, Chloe. I appreciate your grace. I will make sure the next payment is on time. Just make sure it is. She warned, her voice dropping the sweet facade for a flash of cold, hard superiority. We would hate to have to take formal collection actions against family. We are trying to handle this quietly to protect your reputation. She stepped back and closed the heavy oak door. The loud, decisive click of the deadbolt echoed across the porch. I stood there for a moment, staring at the wood. She thought she had just slammed the door on my dignity. She had no idea she had just locked herself inside a federal cage. I turned and walked back down the marble steps. The moment I was safely out of sight, my defeated posture vanished entirely. My spine snapped straight and a cold, predatory smile spread across my face. I got into the driver's seat of my sedan, rolled up the windows, and immediately dialed my attorney. Elias picked up on the second ring. "The bait has been delivered," I said, pulling my car out of the driveway and leaving the estate behind. I handed her the physical check. "The memo line is filled out exactly as you requested." I could hear Elias shifting in his leather chair in Chicago, the sound of pure legal anticipation radiating through the phone. "Excellent work, Maya. Now we just wait for the bank notification." The moment Jamal endorses that check and deposits it into his account, he crosses the point of no return. "Explain the mechanics to me again," I said, wanting to hear the exact shape of the weapon we had just deployed. "By demanding and accepting funds for a commercial lease on a property he does not own, Jamal is committing textbook financial extortion," Elias explained, his voice sharp and precise. "But because you wrote that specific memo line, you have officially documented the transaction as a real estate lease payment. When he deposits that check, it will be processed through the banking system, linking his personal accounts to the fraudulent asset. He is accepting revenue on behalf of Estelle Holdings, LLC, without authorization from the corporate officer. And because our blind trust is headquartered here in Chicago, that check will clear across state lines. They are no longer just playing games with a family estate. They have officially committed interstate wire fraud and mail fraud." I merged onto the highway, the skyline of downtown Atlanta rising in the distance. "They think they are bleeding me dry," I said, watching the city approach. Chloe actually offered to have Jamal give me business advice. Elias let out a rich, booming laugh. "Let them enjoy their fantasy for a few more days. Every dollar they take from you, every designer outfit Chloe buys with that predatory loan is just adding another month to their federal sentencing guidelines. We have the receipt, Maya. The paper trail is completely sealed." I parked my car in this gritty alley behind my new office building. The noise of the city wrapped around me, loud and chaotic and wonderfully real. I walked up the 2 flights of stairs to my cramped workspace, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. I sat down at my drafting table and looked at the blueprints spread across the wood. My family thought they had broken me. They thought stripping me of my comfort and demanding tribute would force me into submission. They were completely unaware that my compliance was a calculated tactical strike. I was not a defeated sister begging for scraps. I was the sole architect of their ruin, patiently waiting for the concrete to dry. Exactly 14 days after Chloe strutted out of my office, the final piece of the legal snare locked firmly into place. I was standing at my drafting table reviewing material costs when my phone vibrated with a single encrypted text message from Elias in Chicago. The check cleared. The funds were deposited across state lines. The federal threshold has been officially crossed. I let out a slow, measured breath, leaning my hands flat against the worn wood of my desk. Jamal had taken the bait. He had legally accepted lease money for a commercial property he did not own, triggering an irreversible chain of federal wire and mail fraud charges. The glass box was now completely sealed around them. They just did not realize the oxygen was rapidly running out. Later that same afternoon, a private courier arrived at my downtown office. The delivery man looked entirely out of place in my gritty neighborhood, holding a thick, oversized envelope made of heavy matte black cardstock. I signed for the delivery and carried it back to my desk. The moment I slid my finger under the flap, I knew exactly what Calvin was plotting. Inside was a lavish gold foil invitation to the Vance Family Legacy Gala. The event was scheduled for the following Saturday night at the Buckhead Country Club, a notoriously exclusive venue that catered to Atlanta's oldest and most ruthless money. The embossed text proudly announced a night to honor the passing of the torch and officially introduced Jamal as the new managing director of the Vance real estate empire. I tossed the ridiculous piece of stationery onto my desk and laughed. A legacy gala. Calvin was throwing a massive self-congratulatory party to flaunt his stolen crown to the city's black business elite. It was a classic Calvin maneuver. He needed an audience to validate his ego, and he needed to publicly cement Jamal's position to ensure the private equity firm that bankrolled their fraudulent loan felt secure in their investment. I had absolutely no intention of going. I grabbed my red pen, intending to go back to my blueprints when my cell phone rang. The caller ID flashed my father's name. I let it ring 3 times, letting him wait before I finally swiped the screen and put him on speakerphone. "Maya, my girl." Calvin's booming baritone voice filled my cramped office, vibrating with that artificial politician warmth he always used when he wanted something. "I trust the courier found your new little office without too much trouble. I wanted to make sure you received your invitation personally." "I received it, Calvin," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat and strictly professional. "But I will not be attending. I have a firm to run and a major city zoning proposal due on Monday. I do not have time to sit in a ballroom and watch you parade Jamal around like a prize-winning show horse." The artificial warmth evaporated from his voice, instantly replaced by the cold, calculating edge I knew all too well. "Do not use that tone with me, Maya. You are going to put on a nice dress, you are going to show up at the Buckhead Country Club, and you are going to smile for the cameras. This gala is not just a party, it is a strategic introduction. I am positioning your brother to take over the board seats Estelle left vacant. I need the entire city to see a unified, supportive family standing behind him." "You need a prop," I countered, gripping the edge of my desk. "You need me there to prove to your investors that there is no bad blood over the estate. You want the optics of the loyal, defeated daughter clapping for her brother, so your private equity friends do not start asking uncomfortable questions about family stability. I will not play a part in your circus. Find someone else to stand in the background." There was a heavy pause on the line. I could hear the faint sound of ice clinking in a glass. Calvin was likely sitting in Grandma Estelle's study, drinking her expensive bourbon, acting like he owned the world. "It is a real shame you feel that way, Maya," he said, his voice dropping dangerously low. "Because I was just having drinks yesterday with Councilman Davis. You know Marcus Davis, do you not? The head of the city zoning committee. The man who holds the deciding vote on that Southside community complex you have been pouring your heart and soul into." My blood ran ice cold. I stopped breathing. The Southside Community Complex was my flagship project. It was the affordable housing initiative Grandma Estelle and I had designed to combat gentrification in our most vulnerable neighborhoods. It was the reason I started my firm in the first place. "What did you do, Calvin?" I demanded, my voice tightening. "I simply caught up with an old friend," Calvin replied smoothly, savoring the power he held over me. "Marcus mentioned your firm submitted a very passionate bid for the project, but he also expressed some concerns about your financial backing now that you are no longer operating under the umbrella of the Vance family estate." I told him I shared his concerns. I told him it would be a massive risk for the city to award a multi-million-dollar contract to a struggling independent contractor with cash flow issues. I told him it might be safer to reject your bid entirely and award the contract to a more established developer, someone like me. You would sabotage your own daughter's career, I asked, forcing my voice to tremble, injecting just enough manufactured panic to let him think he had struck a fatal blow. You would kill an affordable housing project that helps our community just to force me to go to a party. I am protecting the family brand, he corrected coldly. You chose to step out of line, Maya. You chose to isolate yourself in that rundown downtown office. If you want to play the independent maverick, you can deal with the consequences. But if you want Marcus Davis to suddenly feel very confident about approving your city contract, you will be at that country club on Saturday night. You will sit exactly where Chloe tells you to sit. You will applaud when your brother takes the stage, and you will not cause a single ounce of trouble. Do we understand each other? I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping my desk so hard my knuckles ached. I had to swallow my pride. I had to let him feel like an absolute conqueror. I had to feed his delusions so completely that he would never suspect the ground beneath his feet was already rigged to detonate. I understand, I whispered, letting out a shaky, defeated breath. I will be there. Please just leave my city contract alone. Good girl, Calvin said, the smug satisfaction dripping from every syllable. Wear something appropriate. The press will be taking photos and I will not have you looking like a charity case in front of the investors. The line clicked dead. I lowered the phone slowly, setting it down on the wooden drafting table. The panicked, trembling demeanor I had just projected vanished into thin air. I stood up straight, rolling my shoulders back as a dark, predatory smile spread across my face. Calvin thought he was an absolute mastermind. He thought holding my city contract hostage was a brilliant checkmate that forced me into submission. He had no idea that by forcing me to attend a highly publicized gala filled with investors, media, and city officials, he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him. He wanted an audience for his coronation. He was going to get a front-row seat to his own execution. I picked up my phone again and dialed my attorney in Chicago. Elias answered immediately, a man who never seemed to sleep. Elias, I said, my voice ringing with absolute crystal-clear determination. Calvin just threatened to kill my city zoning bid unless I attend his legacy gala this Saturday. He is gathering the entire Atlanta business elite in one room to officially hand the empire over to Jamal. A sharp hum of anticipation came through the speaker. A public gathering of their investors. Elias noted, his tone matching my energy. That is a highly volatile environment, Maya. It is incredibly risky for them. Which makes it the perfect stage for us, I replied. Calvin wants to use me as a prop to prove the family is unified. He wants to show his private equity lenders that his assets are secure. I am going to give him exactly what he asked for. I am going to show up. But I need you to do something for me. I need you to reach out to that private investigator firm we keep on retainer. I need an insider on the country club's audiovisual staff for Saturday night. Elias let out a low, appreciative chuckle. You want to hijack the presentation. You want to project the corporate documents directly onto their stage. I want to burn their house of cards to the ground in front of every single person they are trying to impress, I said, staring at the blank screen of my computer. Get the documents ready, Elias. Format the Estelle Holdings LLC, corporate records, the fraudulent loan signatures, and the federal indictment drafts. We are going to sync them directly to my phone. When Calvin hands my brother the microphone on Saturday night, I am going to take it right out of his hand. I chose a gown of deep emerald green silk. It was not covered in sequins or ostentatious beads like the dresses Chloe favored. It was sleek, architectural, and draped perfectly over my frame. I paired it with a simple gold choker and a pair of pointed toe heels. I looked like a woman who owned herself. My phone containing the encrypted files from Elias was secured in my slim leather clutch. As I pulled my car up to the valet stand at the Buckhead Country Club, the oppressive heat of the Atlanta evening gave way to the crisp, air-conditioned luxury of the venue's grand entrance. Cameras flashed near the red carpet setup, capturing the arrivals of city officials, corporate investors, and local politicians. I walked past the media line, keeping my head high, offering polite smiles to the photographers who likely did not even know my name. They were here for Calvin and his newly crowned heir. I stepped through the heavy glass doors and handed my entry ticket to the concierge, preparing my mind for the battlefield ahead. The grand ballroom was a masterclass in new money excess masking itself as tradition. Enormous crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over dozens of circular tables. Towering floral arrangements of white hydrangeas and imported orchids dominated the center of each table, partially blocking the view of the massive main stage. The room was packed with the most influential figures in Atlanta's Black business community. I recognized bank executives, real estate developers, and city council members mingling with glasses of expensive champagne. My eyes immediately scanned the perimeter, bypassing the wealthy socialites and focusing entirely on the technical setup. In the elevated audiovisual booth at the back of the room, surrounded by mixing boards and lighting controls, a young technician in a black polo shirt caught my gaze. He gave a subtle, barely perceptible nod. Elias had delivered. The insider was in place. My phone was successfully synced to their network. The entire presentation system of the Buckhead Country Club was currently functioning as a loaded weapon, and my thumb was resting directly on the trigger. I navigated my way through the maze of tables, moving gracefully toward the front of the room. The VIP table sat directly beneath the edge of the main stage, draped in heavy black velvet and lined with glowing pillar candles. Calvin sat at the center, shaking hands vigorously with a state senator. Jamal was leaning back in his chair, laughing loudly at a joke someone had just made, looking entirely too comfortable in a tuxedo purchased with fraudulent loan money. And then there was Chloe. She was wearing a massive, heavily beaded silver gown that looked like it weighed 20 pounds. She stood near the edge of the VIP section, acting as the ultimate gatekeeper for the family. The moment she spotted me approaching, the artificial smile on her face vanished. Her eyes darted toward Calvin, who was too busy networking to notice my arrival, and then she immediately stepped directly into my path, effectively blocking me from reaching the empty chair at the end of the family table. Maya, Chloe said, her voice dropping into that familiar, condescending whisper she reserved exclusively for me. You actually showed up. I genuinely thought Calvin was going to have to drag you here kicking and screaming. I looked down at her, maintaining a perfectly serene expression. Calvin invited me, Chloe. I am simply fulfilling my role as the supportive sister. Now, if you will excuse me, the program is about to start. I took a step to the right, intending to bypass her entirely, but she shifted quickly to block me again. A nasty, triumphant gleam lit up her eyes. Oh, honey, there must be some kind of misunderstanding, she purred, crossing her arms over her silver gown. This table is strictly reserved for the executive board of the family trust and the primary investors. It is a highly sensitive networking space. We cannot have independent contractors taking up valuable seats. Before I could respond, she raised a hand and snapped her fingers at a passing hostess. The young woman in a crisp black uniform hurried over, looking anxious. Yes, ma'am, the hostess asked. Chloe did not even look at the young woman when she spoke. There has been a slight seating mix-up. This guest does not belong in the VIP section. Could you please escort her to her designated table? It should be under the general overflow list. The hostess checked her digital tablet, her brow furrowing in confusion. I have Amaya listed, but her seat was moved to table 42 just an hour ago. Table 42 is perfect, Chloe interrupted, offering me a saccharine smile. Have a wonderful evening, Maya. Enjoy the catering. The hostess gave me an apologetic look and gestured for me to follow her. I did not argue. I did not cause a scene. I simply gave Chloe a slow, knowing smile that made her own smirk falter for a fraction of a second, and then I turned around. I followed the hostess away from the stage, away from the glittering crystal centerpieces and the powerful executives. We walked past the mid-tier tables, past the general seating, until we reached the absolute back corner of the grand ballroom. Table 42 was shoved flush against the wall, positioned directly next to the heavy swinging metal doors of the main kitchen. The table did not have a floral arrangement. It did not have pillar candles. It was currently occupied by 3 catering staff members who were quietly eating bread rolls on their 15-minute break. They stopped talking and stared at me awkwardly as I pulled out a chair and sat down in my emerald silk gown. The sound of clattering dishes and shouting chefs echoed through the swinging doors every few seconds, completely drowning out the elegant string quartet playing at the front of the room. This was the ultimate disrespect. Calvin and Chloe had deliberately exiled me to the absolute lowest tier of the room, treating me not just as a disgraced family member, but as the hired help. They wanted me to sit in the shadows, smelling the kitchen exhaust, watching from a distance, as they paraded around like royalty. They wanted me to feel the full crushing weight of my own insignificance while they elevated Jamal to the highest possible status. I set my clutch on the bare table next to a half-eaten bread roll. I reached inside and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim lighting of the back corner. I opened the encrypted application Elias had installed and watched the green synchronization bar hit 100%. The connection to the main stage projector was fully established. I swiped open the hidden folder containing the corporate documents, the fraudulent loan signatures, and the draft of the federal indictment. Every single file was locked, loaded, and ready to be broadcast to the massive screens at the front of the room. I leaned back in my chair, ignoring the chaotic noise of the kitchen behind me, and looked across the massive ballroom at my father and brother. Calvin was now patting Jamal on the back, pointing toward the stage where he would soon deliver his speech. Chloe was sipping champagne, looking incredibly pleased with herself for banishing me to the far wall. They thought they had buried me in the back of the room. They believed they had successfully humiliated the family scapegoat, stripping me of any remaining dignity. They had absolutely no idea they had just given me the perfect, unobstructed vantage point to watch their entire empire burn. The catering staff at Table 42 finished their quick meal and stood up, smoothing their black aprons to return to the floor. One of the servers, an older black woman with kind eyes, noticed my emerald gown and the isolated seat. She quietly poured me a fresh glass of iced water from a crystal pitcher, giving me a small, sympathetic nod before pushing through the heavy metal kitchen doors. I took a slow sip of the cold water, letting the ice chill my throat. I did not need sympathy, but I appreciated the silent solidarity. It grounded me. Across the massive ballroom, the string quartet transitioned into a lively, upbeat classical piece, signaling the formal start of the networking hour. From my vantage point in the shadows, I had a panoramic view of the entire floor. Jamal was in his element. He had abandoned his seat at the VIP table and was currently working the room like a seasoned politician running a campaign circuit. He wore a velvet tuxedo jacket that caught the light with every step, holding a crystal flute of champagne as he moved from table to table. I watched him approach a group of prominent real estate developers and city officials. These were the men who held the keys to Atlanta's infrastructure, the gatekeepers of zoning boards and municipal funding. Jamal shook their hands with exaggerated enthusiasm, pulling them into the kind of aggressive, back-slapping embraces that screamed forced familiarity. He was projecting the ultimate image of the young, dynamic heir ready to take the city by storm. His voice carried over the ambient noise of the ballroom, loud and completely unearned. I could hear snippets of his conversations drifting across the tables. He was talking about the West End commercial blocks. Those were the exact properties Grandma Estelle had purchased back in the 1980s, when bank redlining made it nearly impossible for Black women to secure commercial mortgages. She had fought tooth and nail for every square inch of that pavement, keeping the rents affordable for local Black-owned businesses to thrive. Now Jamal was casually swirling his champagne and promising a group of aggressive developers that he was ready to revitalize the portfolio by pushing out the old tenants and bringing in high-end boutique retail. It was a complete betrayal of everything our grandmother stood for. He was wearing her legacy like a cheap suit, ready to sell off decades of her blood and sweat, just to hear a few rich men tell him he was a genius. Calvin was right there beside him, acting as the ultimate hype man. My father guided Jamal through the crowd, introducing him to the old guard of the city. Calvin's face was flushed with absolute pride. He was finally getting the son he always wanted, the powerful business magnate who commanded respect in rooms filled with millionaires. It did not matter to Calvin that Jamal's entire persona was funded by a fraudulent predatory loan. It did not matter that they were literally bankrupting the estate to pay for the velvet tuxedo and the imported champagne. Calvin was addicted to the illusion, and Jamal was the perfect actor to play the part. Chloe trailed a few steps behind them, making sure she was perfectly positioned whenever the event photographers snapped a picture. She would pause, tilt her head, and offer a brilliant practice smile, making sure the massive diamond necklace she wore caught the flashbulbs. She was securing her social capital, cementing her status among the wealthy elite. I lowered my gaze from their sickening performance and looked down at the glowing screen of my phone. The phone rested flat on the white tablecloth, perfectly concealed from the rest of the room. The encrypted application Elias had installed displayed a solid green synchronization bar. I tapped the screen once, navigating to the hidden folder. The interface was incredibly simple, but devastatingly effective. I opened the first file, verifying the resolution on my screen. It was the Articles of Incorporation for Estelle Holdings, LLC. The bold black text explicitly named me as the sole chief executive officer and majority shareholder. I swiped to the next document. It was the deed of trust, proving that every single asset Calvin thought he inherited was legally locked inside the corporate entity I controlled. I took another sip of my water, my heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm. I swiped to the third file. This was the kill shot. It was a high-resolution scan of the $4.5 million bridge loan Jamal had signed. His signature was right there on the bottom line, plain as day, right next to Calvin's signature as the guarantor. Attached to it was the forged affidavit of title, where they explicitly lied to a lending institution about owning the collateral. And finally, I checked the draft of the federal indictment. Elias and his legal team in Chicago had prepared a masterful document outlining the interstate wire fraud and mail fraud charges. The paperwork was flawless. I tapped the screen, locking the files into the queue. All I had to do was press a single green icon in the center of my screen, and those documents would instantly hijack the country club's audiovisual system, overriding whatever slides Calvin had prepared, and projecting my truth onto the massive 20-foot screens flanking the main stage. I looked up toward the elevated technical booth at the back of the ballroom. The young technician in the black polo shirt caught my eye again. He gave me a quick thumbs up, adjusting the lighting sliders on his massive mixing board. The insider access Elias had purchased was worth every single penny. The entire room was wired to my fingertips. The lights in the grand ballroom began to dim, slowly dropping the ambient illumination to a soft, theatrical glow. The sudden shift in lighting signaled that the networking hour was concluding and the formal presentation was about to begin. The string quartet played a final lingering chord before packing up their instruments. A hush fell over the crowd as the guests began to take their seats at their designated tables. I watched Jamal and Chloe make their way back to the VIP table at the front of the room. Chloe smoothed her heavy silver gown and sat down, looking exceptionally pleased with herself. Jamal took the seat next to her, adjusting his bow tie and offering a confident nod to a nearby bank executive. They looked so incredibly secure in their stolen kingdom. They truly believed they had won. They thought they had permanently exiled me to the kitchen doors, leaving me to watch my own replacement from the cheap seats. Calvin did not sit down. Instead, my father adjusted his tailored suit jacket, took a deep breath, and began walking up the short staircase leading to the main stage. He moved with the slow, deliberate stride of a conqueror. A spotlight snapped on, tracking his movement and illuminating him against the dark velvet curtains serving as the backdrop. The massive projector screens on either side of the stage lit up, displaying a beautifully designed graphic that read, "The Vance Family Legacy, A New Era." I sat alone in the shadows of table 42, the cold glass of water in my left hand and my phone glowing under my right. My finger hovered less than an inch above the green launch icon. The tension in the air was electric, thick and heavy with anticipation. I was entirely perfectly calm. I watched my father step up to the sleek acrylic podium and tap the microphone. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom. The stage was finally set. The audience was captive. The moment of absolute destruction had arrived. Calvin tapped the microphone a second time. The sharp percussive sound snapped the massive ballroom to absolute attention. The low hum of networking conversations and the clinking of fine crystal instantly ceased. Even the catering staff standing near my table in the shadows stopped moving, their hands resting respectfully at their sides. Calvin commanded the room with the practiced ease of a seasoned politician, leaning into the sleek acrylic podium and allowing a heavy, solemn silence to stretch across the country club before he finally spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and esteemed partners, Calvin began, his booming baritone voice resonating through the state-of-the-art sound system. We are gathered here tonight under the banner of legacy. For decades, my mother, Estelle Vance, built a foundation of excellence in Atlanta. She turned dirt into gold, and she turned vision into brick and mortar. When she passed, she left behind a massive vacuum, a void that threatened to destabilize the very market we all rely on. But a true legacy does not falter when the founder falls. It adapts, it evolves, and it requires bold, decisive leadership to step into the breach. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the front rows of VIP tables. I watched the bank executives and real estate magnates nodding in solemn agreement, completely captivated by his performance. They were buying every single word of his fabricated narrative. When the mantle of this empire fell to me, Calvin continued, pressing his hands flat against the edges of the podium. I knew that preserving our wealth was not enough. We must expand. We must aggressively pursue the future. And that kind of aggressive expansion requires a specific kind of hunger. It requires a visionary. It requires a man who understands that in this city, you either devour the competition or you become the feast. Calvin extended his right hand, pointing directly at the center of the VIP table. The spotlight shifted, tracking his gesture and illuminating Jamal in a brilliant circle of white light. Jamal stood up, adjusting his velvet tuxedo jacket with a practiced look of humble gratitude that made my stomach churn. That man is my son, Jamal Vance. Calvin declared, his voice swelling with manufactured pride. Jamal has always possessed a natural, relentless instinct for commerce. While others play it safe, clutching their pennies and settling for mediocrity, Jamal takes risks. He sees the broad horizon. He is the absolute pinnacle of Black excellence, and he represents the ruthless, innovative spirit that will drive Estelle Holdings into its next billion-dollar chapter. The ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. Investors stood to their feet, clapping enthusiastically for a man whose greatest financial achievement to date was successfully forging a signature on a predatory loan application. Chloe stood beside him, beaming with radiant triumph, her heavy silver gown sparkling under the spotlight as she rested a manicured hand on his shoulder. They looked exactly like American royalty. Calvin waited for the applause to die down, holding up a hand to quiet the room. But as he settled back in behind the podium, his expression shifted. The warm paternal pride vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, hard edge. He gripped the microphone stand and leaned forward, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the glow of the chandeliers. However, Calvin said, his voice dropping an octave, chilling the warm air of the ballroom. True excellence requires absolute unity. A family is a fortress, and a fortress cannot stand if there are cracks in the foundation. We are here tonight to celebrate loyalty to the bloodline. But unfortunately, I must also address the painful reality of what happens when that loyalty is rejected. A sudden heavy tension settled over the room. The executives in the front rows shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the dangerous pivot in his speech. I sat perfectly still in the back corner, my spine locked straight, my hand resting lightly over the screen of my phone. Calvin raised his hand again, but this time he did not point to the VIP section. He extended his arm and pointed a single accusing finger directly over the heads of the crowd, aiming straight for the swinging kitchen doors at the absolute rear of the venue. The spotlight operator hesitated, clearly confused by the gesture, but Calvin kept his arm rigidly extended, forcing every single person in the massive ballroom to turn around and look into the shadows. We have a cautionary tale in the room with us tonight, Calvin announced, his voice echoing with absolute authority. My daughter Maya was given every opportunity to stand beside her brother. She was offered a place at the table. But instead of contributing to the family vision, she chose defiance. She chose to isolate herself in some rundown downtown office, playing the part of an independent martyr. I felt the eyes of 500 of Atlanta's most powerful people searching the darkness, trying to locate the target of his wrath. I did not shrink down in my chair. I kept my chin leveled, staring straight back at the stage, unblinking and completely unmoved. Let Maya serve as a living, breathing example to every young entrepreneur in this room. Calvin continued, treating my life like a public dissection. When you refuse to fall in line, when you reject the wisdom and protection of your family's empire to chase petty little charity projects, you do not become a maverick. You become irrelevant. You end up sitting in the back of the room watching your betters shape the future while you beg the city council for scraps. A wave of low, awkward laughter rippled through the ballroom. It was the sound of wealthy sycophants eagerly appeasing a powerful man. The real estate developers chuckled. The city politicians offered polite, stifled smiles. From the VIP table, I heard Chloe's distinct, breathless laugh, cutting clearly through the ambient noise of the room. She was practically vibrating with joy, watching her father-in-law publicly execute my professional reputation. The older catering server standing near my table tightened her grip on her water pitcher, her jaw clenched in silent outrage on my behalf. She recognized the utter cruelty of what was happening. A father was actively attempting to destroy his own daughter to inflate the ego of his son. "Look at what happens when you turn your back on your legacy," Calvin declared, delivering his final crushing blow. "You lose your seat at the table, you lose the respect of your peers, and you watch the real architects of the city move forward without you." The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Calvin had successfully asserted his absolute dominance. He had established himself as a ruthless kingmaker who would publicly humiliate his own flesh and blood to protect his brand. He had painted me as a bitter, failed outcast, cementing Jamal's position as the sole legitimate heir to the Vance fortune. Calvin took a step back from the podium, a smug, victorious smile spreading across his face. He extended his hand toward the steps of the stage, gesturing for his golden child to come up and claim his stolen crown. "Please join me in welcoming the new managing director of the Vance estate, my son Jamal Vance." Calvin boomed over the speakers. The applause started again, louder and more frantic this time, as the attendees rushed to prove their loyalty to the new regime. Jamal strutted toward the stairs, buttoning his velvet jacket, his chest puffed out with unimaginable arrogance. I sat at table 42, the roar of the clapping crowd washing over me. Calvin had just given his grand performance. He had laid out his entire fictional narrative in front of every major investor and lender in the city of Atlanta. He had confidently, proudly, and publicly tied his entire reputation to Jamal's leadership. They had gorged themselves on the bait. They had swallowed the hook completely. I looked down at the glowing screen of my phone. The green synchronization bar remained steady. The files were queued. The federal draft was ready. The forged loan documents were primed for projection. I did not feel a single ounce of humiliation. I did not feel sadness or rejection. I felt the cold metallic click of a trap springing shut. I picked up my phone, gripping it firmly in my right hand. I pushed my chair back, letting the wooden legs scrape loudly against the hardwood floor. I stood up, smoothing the front of my emerald silk gown. It was time to take the microphone. I did not run. I did not rush. I stepped away from the shadows of table 42 and began my march down the center aisle. The emerald silk of my gown brushed heavily against the patterned carpet. The applause for my brother was still echoing off the crystal chandeliers, but as I moved deeper into the light, a strange ripple effect occurred. The people sitting at the outer tables noticed me first. They saw the woman, who had just been publicly executed, walking straight toward the executioner, with her head held high and her posture unbending. The clapping in the back rows began to falter. The silence spread like a virus, rolling forward row by row as I passed. By the time I reached the mid-tier tables, the deafening roar of the crowd had dwindled to a confused, scattered smattering of applause. Heads turned. Whispers erupted. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the stage. I did not look at the bank executives who were staring at me in bewilderment. I did not look at the local politicians who had just laughed at my expense. I looked only at the three people who thought they had buried me. Jamal had just reached the bottom of the stage stairs when he realized the applause had died prematurely. He turned around his velvet tuxedo, suddenly looking less like a king's robe and more like a cheap borrowed costume. His smug smile vanished entirely, replaced by a look of profound bewilderment as he saw me approaching. He took a hasty step sideways, attempting to block my path to the stairs, but I did not even break my stride. I walked right past him, clipping his shoulder with just enough force to knock him off balance and send him stumbling back against the velvet-draped VIP table. Chloe jumped to her feet, her heavy silver gown catching on the leg of her chair. "Maya," she hissed, her voice frantic and shrill, stripping away all her previous fake sweetness. "Security. Someone call security right now. She does not belong up there." But the country club security guards did not move. The sheer absolute confidence of my approach confused them. I was not screaming. I was not acting erratic or hysterical. I was walking with the absolute unshakable authority of a woman who owned the building. I placed my foot on the first carpeted step of the main stage. Calvin was standing behind the sleek acrylic podium holding the microphone. His face morphed from arrogant triumph to absolute fury. The veins in his neck bulged against his crisp white collar. He could not comprehend why I was not cowering in the kitchen shadows. "What do you think you are doing?" Calvin demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper that the microphone barely caught. "Get off this stage right now before I have you thrown out into the street like the trash you are." I climbed the final step and stood directly in front of him. He was a tall, imposing man who had spent my entire life using his physical presence to intimidate me. But tonight, looking into his eyes under the glaring stage lights, I realized he was just a desperate aging bully who had severely miscalculated his opponent. "I am stepping into the breach, Calvin," I said, throwing his own grand speech right back in his face. Before he could process the words or signal the guards standing near the exit doors, I reached out and wrapped my hand firmly around the microphone. He gripped it tightly, his knuckles turning white, but he could not yank it away without causing a massive physical altercation in front of 500 of his most important investors. We locked eyes in a brief silent war of wills. He looked into my face and saw the cold, dead certainty in my gaze. He saw that I was not bluffing, and I was not afraid of him anymore. He loosened his grip just a fraction, and I smoothly pulled the microphone directly out of his hand. I stepped around the podium, positioning myself dead center on the stage. The entire ballroom was holding its collective breath. The silence was absolute and suffocating. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents and the rapid, ragged breathing of my brother standing frozen at the bottom of the stairs. I raised my left hand, holding my phone up high so the entire room could see it. My thumb rested gently over the green launch icon Elias and the audiovisual technician had prepared. "You spoke a lot about legacy tonight, Calvin," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the state-of-the-art sound system, ringing with a profound and absolute authority. "You spoke about vision. You spoke about preserving what my grandmother built. But there is one critical detail you forgot to mention to your esteemed guests and your highly leveraged private equity lenders." I pressed the green button. Behind me, the massive 20-foot projector screens that had been displaying the Vance family legacy graphic flickered for a split second. The screens went pitch black. A collective gasp rippled through the front rows. Then the screens flashed back to life, flooding the stage and the front tables in stark, bright white light. There were no family crests. There were no glamorous photographs of Jamal. Projected in massive high-definition resolution across the entire ballroom were the official stamped and notarized articles of incorporation for Estelle Holdings, LLC. I did not need to explain the documents to the room. The executives and real estate developers sitting in the VIP rows immediately recognized the heavy legal formatting of corporate trust paperwork. Their eyes darted rapidly across the projected text, reading the complex legal jargon that outlined the blind trust my grandmother had established half a decade ago. I tapped the screen on my phone, advancing to the second slide. The massive projectors shifted, displaying the executive succession and shareholder transfer clause. The text was blown up to towering proportions, making it impossible for anyone in the room to miss or misinterpret. Right in the center of the screen, highlighted in bright, undeniable yellow, was the legal designation of power. Maya Renee Vance, majority shareholder and sole chief executive officer. The shockwave that hit the ballroom was almost physical. Chairs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor as several prominent investors actually stood up to get a better look at the legal stamps on the documents. The silence broke, shattering into a chaotic roar of overlapping voices, shouts of confusion, and the frantic clicking of cell phone cameras. The very people Calvin had invited to witness my destruction were now documenting his. I turned to look at Calvin. The arrogant kingmaker had completely vanished. His face was the color of wet ash. He was staring up at the massive screens, his mouth hanging open in sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked back at me, his eyes wide and frantic, finally understanding the monumental, catastrophic trap he had walked blindly into. Jamal let out a choked, desperate sound from the bottom of the stairs. He grabbed the edge of the stage, looking up at me like a drowning man, grasping for a lifeline that was rapidly pulling away. "You claim that Grandma Estelle forgot to sign a will?" I said, speaking directly into the microphone, my voice slicing effortlessly through the mounting chaos of the ballroom. "You stood in front of this city and claimed she defaulted her empire to you. But Estelle Vance never forgot a single detail in her life. She did not leave you a real estate empire, Calvin. She left you an empty shell. You do not own the properties, you do not own the commercial districts, you do not even own the roof over your head. I do." I turned my back on Calvin, leaving him frozen behind the sleek acrylic podium. I faced the sea of wide eyes and dropped jaws in the grand ballroom. The silence was absolute, heavy, and charged with the kind of electric shock that only comes from witnessing a public execution. I raised the microphone to my lips, my voice ringing out steady and commanding over the state-of-the-art sound system. "Good evening," I said, letting the simple greeting echo off the crystal chandeliers. "Allow me to properly introduce myself to those of you who were just told I was simply a bitter outcast. My name is Maya Renee. I am the sole chief executive officer and majority shareholder of Estelle Holdings, LLC. A murmur rippled through the back rows, quickly growing into a tidal wave of frantic whispers across the room. The elite business leaders of Atlanta, the politicians and the real estate magnates, were rapidly processing the fact that they had just spent the entire evening kissing the ring of an absolute fraud. They had toasted to a king who did not even own the glass he was drinking from. My grandmother knew that true legacy requires ironclad protection. I continued pacing slowly across the front of the stage, projecting absolute authority. She knew that handing generational wealth to someone who had bankrupted every venture he touched would be a fatal error. She built an impenetrable fortress around her assets. Unfortunately, my father and brother decided to try and break into that fortress using a battering ram of federal fraud. I tapped the screen of my phone. The massive projectors behind me shifted again. The corporate structure documents vanished, replaced by a deeply alarming financial record. "What you are looking at," I announced, pointing up at the towering 20-foot screen, "is a $4.5 million commercial bridge loan. It is a high-interest predatory cash injection secured just 2 weeks ago. If you look closely at the bottom line, you will see two very familiar signatures." I tapped my screen again, zooming in on the bottom of the document. The signatures blew up to massive proportions, perfectly visible to the very back of the room. Jamal was listed as the primary borrower. Calvin was listed as the guarantor. "Now, borrowing money is not a crime," I said, keeping my tone conversational but razor sharp. "But look at the collateral listed on page 3. The screen shifted, displaying the asset schedule. I read it aloud, ensuring every single person in the room heard the specific details. "The historic estate we are standing near tonight, the East Point commercial districts, the South Side properties. These are the exact assets my brother pledged as security for this loan. Properties he does not legally own, properties that belong entirely to a corporate trust he has absolutely zero legal authority over." I stepped right to the edge of the stage, looking directly down into the VIP section. I locked eyes with the three men in expensive charcoal suits sitting in the front row. They were the private equity lenders, the men from the country club network who had approved this transaction over a round of golf. They were currently sweating profusely, their faces draining of all color as they realized the magnitude of their exposure. To the gentleman from the lending firm who expedited this cash transfer, I said, offering them a cold, merciless smile, "You bypassed standard due diligence to help out an old friend. You relied on Calvin's social reputation instead of pulling a proper commercial title search. I have very bad news for you." The affidavit of title Jamal provided was completely forged. Estelle Holdings, LLC never authorized this liability. Your $4.5 million is entirely unsecured, and my legal team in Chicago will ensure you write it off as a total loss due to your own gross negligence. One of the lending executives actually dropped his crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the hardwood floor, the sharp sound cutting through the stunned silence. Panic was officially setting in. Men in expensive suits were pulling out their phones, frantically whispering to each other, calculating their legal exposure. Calvin suddenly surged forward, attempting to grab the microphone back from my hand. "Cut the power!" he shouted at the back of the room, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "Someone cut the screens right now." But the audiovisual technician at the back of the room simply crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, ignoring the frantic demands. The system was locked. I sidestepped Calvin effortlessly, keeping the microphone firmly in my grasp. I tapped my phone one more time. The screen shifted to display a highly detailed banking routing history. "And where did that $4.5 million go?" I asked, projecting the itemized list of their spending spree. "Did it go toward modernizing the commercial portfolio? Did it fund new acquisitions? No. It funded a matte black imported sports car. It funded first-class tickets to Paris. It funded the designer silver gown Chloe is wearing tonight. You are looking at a family that financed their illusions of grandeur with stolen equity." I walked over to the small table on the stage where I had set down my black leather clutch upon my arrival. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, sleek black legal folder. I carried it back to the edge of the stage, looking down at Jamal. My brother was hyperventilating at the bottom of the stairs, gripping the banister like he might collapse at any second. The velvet tuxedo jacket he had been so proud of now looked like a straitjacket. "Jamal," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm resonance, "step up here and take what belongs to you." He could barely move, his legs trembling as he took a single step up. He reached out a shaking hand. I looked down at him and pressed the thick black folder firmly against his chest, forcing him to take it. "In that folder you will find a formal notice of foreclosure on your personal assets," I explained, making sure the microphone picked up every word. "That sports car you parked in my driveway, the European vacation, deposits the designer clothes you and your wife have been parading around in. All of it is being seized to cover the immediate damages. Your personal accounts are frozen." Jamal stared down at the black folder, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. He looked like a cornered animal realizing the trap had just snapped shut on his leg. "But that is the least of your problems, Jamal." I continued, stepping down the stairs to stand on the exact same level as him. "Behind the foreclosure notice is a draft of the indictment my legal team has submitted to the authorities. You forged legal documents. You signed a fraudulent affidavit. You took $4.5 million and moved it across state lines. That is interstate wire fraud. That is mail fraud. That is felony conspiracy to defraud a lending institution." I leaned in close so only the microphone and Jamal could catch the final chilling detail. "You are not a King Jamal. You are a federal criminal, and you are going to prison." The black legal folder slipped from Jamal's trembling fingers and hit the stage floor with a heavy, resonant thud. Crisp white documents spilled across the polished wood, exposing the bright red stamps of the foreclosure notices and the stark, terrifying layout of the federal indictment drafts. Jamal collapsed to his knees, scrambling frantically to gather the scattered pages, as if hiding them would somehow erase the massive reality currently projected on the 20-foot screens overhead. His breaths came in short, ragged gasps. He could not even look at me. He was completely broken. Chloe shoved her way past the frozen country club security guards and stormed up the carpeted stairs of the stage. Her heavy silver gown dragged awkwardly behind her, catching on her heels. She snatched a piece of paper right out of Jamal's frantic grasp. I watched her perfectly manicured nails dig into the foreclosure notice. Her pale face drained of all color before flushing a brilliant, furious red. Her eyes darted from the legal document to the massive projections overhead, and finally to the pathetic kneeling figure of her husband. "You lied to me!" she screamed, the sound piercing through the stunned silence of the ballroom. Her voice lost every ounce of its breathless, sweet cadence, transforming into a harsh, furious shriek. "You told me the estate was yours. You told me the money was cleared. You dragged me into a federal bank fraud investigation, Jamal. My name is on the registration for that sports car. I signed the paperwork for the Paris trip." Jamal reached up, grabbing the shimmering fabric of her silver dress. "Chloe, baby, please," he begged, his voice cracking, turning into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Dad said it was fine. Dad said he handled all the legalities. We can fix this. We just need to talk to the lawyers." She violently yanked her dress out of his grasp, stepping back as if his very touch was diseased. "Do not touch me," she snarled, glaring down at him with absolute unmasked disgust. "I did not marry you to go to federal prison. I did not marry you to be humiliated in front of the entire city. You are completely broke. You have absolutely nothing. You are a fraud." Chloe turned her back on her husband and stormed down the stairs, shoving past the wealthy socialites who were now actively recording her meltdown on their phones. The illusion of their grand generational wealth had evaporated, leaving nothing but the ugly, desperate reality of a marriage built entirely on stolen money. She marched toward the exit doors, leaving Jamal sobbing on the floor of the stage. The panic finally broke through Calvin's paralysis. He realized the private equity lenders were already out of their seats in the front row, pulling on their suit jackets and frantically dialing their corporate crisis management teams. He was watching his entire social and financial standing disintegrate into dust right in front of his eyes. He lunged forward and grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. His face was slick with sweat, his breathing erratic and shallow. "Maya, stop this right now." Calvin pleaded, his voice a frantic, desperate whisper that completely lacked its usual booming authority. "Turn off the screens. Tell them this is a misunderstanding. We can fix the deed transfers. We can retroactively approve the loans through your corporate trust. You have made your point. You proved you are the smartest person in the room. But we have to handle this privately. We have to handle this as a family before the federal authorities see those documents." I looked down at the hand gripping my arm. I felt a surge of pure, absolute disgust. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply yanked my arm back with a sharp, violent motion, severing his hold on me completely. Calvin stumbled forward, losing his balance for a fraction of a second, his tailored suit suddenly looking far too big for his shrinking frame. "You do not get to invoke the word family tonight, Calvin," I said, staring dead into his panicked eyes. "You stopped being my family the moment you stood in our grandmother's foyer and tried to erase my existence. You stopped being my family when you let your son drain her accounts and mocked the very legacy she spent a lifetime building. You do not want to handle this as a family. You want a corporate bailout. You want the scapegoat to save you from the catastrophic consequences of your own unmitigated arrogance." He opened his mouth to argue, to offer some empty manipulation, but I did not give him the chance. I raised the microphone to my lips one last time, ensuring that every single person in the massive ballroom heard my final judgment. I looked at Calvin and then down at Jamal, who was still weeping over the scattered federal documents on the stage floor. "You won't get a single cent," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality, echoing the exact words he had used to discard me at Grandma Estelle's repast. "It is time you learned to fend for yourselves." I let the microphone slip from my fingers. It hit the wooden stage floor with a loud, resonant thud that fed back through the massive speakers. The sharp, piercing sound sealed the end of their reign. I turned my back on the stage and began walking down the center aisle of the ballroom. The sea of powerful executives, politicians, and socialites immediately parted for me. No one spoke a single word. No one dared to block my path. The men who had laughed at Calvin's cruel jokes moments earlier simply stepped aside, watching me with a profound, undeniable respect. I even caught the eye of the older catering server standing near the kitchen doors. She offered me a slow, proud nod of solidarity. I was no longer the outcast daughter sitting in the shadows. I was the uncontested architect of the Vance legacy. Behind me, the ballroom descended into absolute chaos. I could hear the aggressive shouts of the private equity lenders demanding answers from Calvin. I could hear the frantic sobbing of my brother, realizing his life of privilege was officially over. But I did not look back. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the Buckhead Country Club, leaving the toxic ruins of my bloodline entirely in the past. The night air was cool and crisp against my skin as I handed my ticket to the valet. I drove my practical sedan away from the glittering venue, navigating the familiar winding roads of Atlanta, until the massive wrought iron gates of Grandma Estelle's estate loomed in the headlights. The security system recognized my vehicle, and the heavy gate slowly swung open, welcoming me home. I parked in the circular driveway right where Chloe's imported sports car had been towed away just hours earlier. I stepped out of my car and walked up the wide marble steps. I reached into my purse and pulled out the heavy iron keys, the true master keys that Elias had transferred to me in Chicago. I slid the key into the heavy oak door and turned the lock. The door swung open, revealing the grand foyer bathed in soft moonlight. The house was quiet, steady, and safe. I stepped across the threshold, closing the door firmly behind me, ready to build the future my grandmother and I had always dreamed of.